I can't say I ever envisioned myself living in a place so remote, but there I was, alone with my wife Lauren in a wooden house I'd built from salvaged lumber, perched at the edge of the Okefenokee Swamp in southeastern Georgia. I wanted a fresh start, something that couldn't be bought with money alone, an off-grid life powered by the sun, fed by a small vegetable patch, and watered by the swamp's bounty. It sounded so idyllic when we first drew up our plans, but as the days turned to weeks and the nights stretched long and thin, I came to realize there's a reason few people choose to call this place home. It didn't begin with some dramatic manifestation of evil or a single knock in the dead of night. Rather, it crept in. Like the fog that moves across the marsh at dawn, it slithered through our humble homestead, a haunting undercurrent that we couldn't name or pin down. That creeping sense of unease worsened day by day. Lauren and I had been married only 2 years when we moved here. She was always the practical one, good with numbers, budgets, and making sure we had enough resources to survive. I'm more of a dreamer. My father taught me basic carpentry and how to live lightly off the land, so I thought I was ready for whatever the swamp could throw at us. But no one prepared me for what lurked beyond the cypress trees. We arrived in late August, just when the sun scorches your back even in the early hours. Our solar panels had been mounted on the only patch of dry land not choked by cypress knees. We pitched a large canvas tent for those first 2 weeks while I finished building the house. From day one, the swamp reminded us it was in control. Mosquitoes the size of quarters, gators sunning themselves a stone's throw away, snakes weaving in and out of the water. Lauren was unfazed, at least outwardly. She had read enough about living off-grid to be prepared for the humidity and pests. I, on the other hand, was consumed by the beauty of it, the Spanish moss hanging from ancient trees, the shimmering water that felt alive with hidden creatures. There was a mystical quality to this place, an energy that was both tranquil and unnerving. The cabin took shape gradually, thick pine beams for the frame, a slanted roof to catch rainfall for our barrel system, and a modest porch facing the swamp so we could watch the sunset. Inside, we planned 2 small rooms, a makeshift kitchen, and a combined bedroom living area. We weren't building a palace, we wanted simplicity. I remember the day we moved our belongings from the tent into the new cabin. Lauren joked about the luxurious wooden floors, while I hammered in the last few nails. There was a sense of triumph in our hearts. We were doing it. We were living our dream, forging a connection with nature. But that very night, the swamp began singing a different tune. The first inkling of something off came not from a sound, but from dancing lights in the distance. We were relaxing on the porch after a day of hard labor, sipping sweet tea in the muggy twilight, when Lauren noticed it first. "Charlie," she whispered, leaning forward in her chair. "Look by the tree line." I squinted, thinking maybe she was pointing out fireflies. But these lights were too large, too erratic. They appeared and disappeared behind the moss-laden branches, bobbing and weaving like silent lanterns. I turned off the lantern we kept on the porch, plunging us into near-total darkness. Now the mysterious lights stood out even more, faintly yellow, then suddenly blue. They would flicker twice, then vanish, only to reappear behind a different set of trees. "Maybe some campers," I offered, though my gut told me that was unlikely. This part of the swamp wasn't a popular camping site, especially not in the suffocating heat of late summer. Lauren didn't respond. I could sense the tension in her posture. We watched those lights for maybe half an hour, saying little, until they finally faded away altogether. A part of me hoped it was a natural phenomenon, perhaps swamp gas or some kind of bioluminescent insect, but that logical explanation never quite sat right. We tried not to let one strange night overshadow our resolve. The next morning, I was up before sunrise, checking our solar rig and watering the small garden patch we'd planted behind the cabin. Lauren began her day tidying up, setting up a proper pantry area, and making a list of items we needed on our next trip into town. Before we could eat breakfast, we found the footprints. They circled around our cabin in a wide arc, a trail imprinted in the damp soil that glistened from the overnight dew. At first, I assumed they were animal tracks, maybe a large raccoon or a bobcat, but as I knelt down for a closer look, dread pricked at my skin. They looked almost human, though the shape was elongated, the toes too narrow. Lauren crouched beside me. "Human footprints, you think?" she asked, her voice hushed. I didn't know what to say. They seemed wrong, not the footprints of a person strolling. The stride was awkward. The toes pointed at odd angles, and they were fresh, probably made in the early hours of the morning, while we slept just a few feet away inside the cabin. That day, we decided it was time to call our old friend Dennis Ray. A seasoned adventurer, Dennis was the type who would ride his motorcycle through the middle of nowhere on a whim. He knew how to track animals from spending years in the wilderness out west. If anyone could put our minds at ease, or confirm our worst fears, it was Dennis. Dennis showed up 2 days later on his battered motorcycle, sweat pouring down his temples. He took one look at our modest cabin and whistled. "I can't believe you two live out here," he joked, though I caught a flicker of concern in his eye. "Heard you've got some weird footprints." We showed him the tracks. By then, they'd partially dried, but there were fresh ones too, near the edge of the swamp. Dennis frowned, pressing his palm into the soil next to one. "I've seen a lot of tracks," he muttered, "but never anything like this. Not from a gator or any large cat. They're almost human, but not quite." Lauren wrapped her arms around herself. "So, what? You think someone's messing with us?" Dennis shrugged, but his expression was grim. "Could be. Or it's something that we city folk don't have a name for." That night, we all settled inside the cabin, determined to stay awake. We armed ourselves. Lauren and I each carried a hunting knife, and Dennis had his pistol. The plan was to wait, watch, and see if anything approached. But by midnight, none of us could keep our eyes open. The swamp's heavy stillness lulled us into a half-sleep. At around 3 a.m., I awoke with a jolt. Lauren was shaking me frantically. "Dennis! Where's Dennis?" she hissed. He wasn't in the corner of the room where he'd laid his bedroll. The cabin door stood ajar, a sliver of moonlight illuminating the threshold. Heart pounding, I grabbed the flashlight and crept outside. The night hummed with insect life, and I felt a clammy film of sweat break across my forehead. "Dennis!" I called in a hushed voice. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted movement, something darting between the cypress trees. I aimed the flashlight beam and glimpsed Dennis stepping deeper into the swamp, his head cocked as though listening to an unseen presence. He walked oddly, as if in a trance. "Dennis!" Lauren shouted, sprinting to catch up. I followed, stumbling over roots and vines. We caught him by the arm. His face was pale and slick with sweat, eyes unfocused. "It was calling me," he murmured in a hollow voice, a woman's voice, out there. He pointed toward the black expanse of marsh. I shuddered, shining the flashlight around us. We saw nothing but thick trunks and coiling roots. The sound of water lapping against the shore was the only thing that met our ears. The following morning, Dennis was subdued, eyes downcast. He said little about the night's events, only that he'd thought he heard a woman calling his name. It was enough for Lauren. She insisted we get to the nearest library or historical society and find out if there were any stories about ghosts or spirits in this region. Maybe it was superstition, maybe not, but we had to try something. Lauren and I drove for an hour into the small town of Folkestone, leaving Dennis behind to watch over the cabin. The Folkestone Public Library was a modest building, but the local history section had a few books on the Okefenokee. We pored over them, searching for references to skinwalkers, shapeshifters, or other indigenous legends. Eventually, a thin, older man with wire-rimmed glasses approached us. He introduced himself as Rob Larkin, a local historian. "You won't find much in that book," he said softly, glancing at the battered hardcover in my hands. "A lot of the old tales were never written down, passed along by word of mouth." He studied me a moment. "Are you folks living in the swamp?" "Yes," Lauren answered, hesitant. "We've had experiences." Rob nodded knowingly. "My grandparents used to speak of spirits that walk these waters. Some are guardians, but others, they lure you away. They say they mimic voices you trust. Some call them shapeshifters or skinwalkers." He sighed. "I always wrote it off as legend, but the swamp has secrets. Just be careful." He recommended we try leaving small offerings or protective tokens near the cabin: herbs, salt lines, carved symbols in the bark of surrounding trees. It sounded like old folklore, but we were desperate. We took notes, thanked him, and drove back, armed with fresh ideas. That afternoon, we gathered sage, salt, and a few other items we had. Lauren busied herself lining the windowsills and door frames with salt. I took a knife and carved simple crosses and runic symbols into the cypress trees in a circle around the property. The musky smell of fresh wood heavy in the air. Dennis hung braided strings of sage and rosemary from the porch eaves. I'd be lying if I said I was confident these measures would work. But as dusk settled, a curious sense of calm fell over our homestead. We cooked a modest dinner, ate mostly in silence, and then prepared for another sleepless vigil. This time, Dennis set up a motion sensor camera on a nearby tree, aiming it at the front porch. If anything approached, we'd catch it on film. For a few hours, nothing happened. We took turns napping and patrolling the perimeter, scanning the tree line with flashlights. Around midnight, Lauren tapped me on the shoulder as we sat inside, sipping black coffee. "Do you hear that?" At first, all I caught was the usual buzz of cicadas and the low croaking of frogs. Then, just on the edges of hearing, I made out what sounded like chanting. Low, rhythmic, almost a humming that rose and fell with the breeze. Dennis opened the door a crack, pressing his ear against the humid night air. "It's coming from the direction of the old footpath," he whispered. "I'll check the camera feed." He grabbed the small screen linked to the motion sensor camera. Nothing. No movement near the porch. So we ventured outside in a tight formation, flashlights off, letting our eyes adjust to the moonlit surroundings. The chanting was clearer now, as though multiple voices formed a melodic drone. My heart pounded, fear mixing with morbid curiosity. We crept about 50 yards from the cabin, weaving between cypress knees and thick vines, until the chanting abruptly stopped. In the eerie silence that followed, a light breeze swept through, rustling the Spanish moss overhead. I heard a snapping twig behind me and spun around, flashlight beam darting wildly. Nothing. Then a whisper. My name. "Charlie," it said softly, directly into my ear. I yelped, spinning around again. No one was there. Lauren clamped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. Dennis was trembling, pistol raised. The chanting returned, but it sounded farther away now, as if taunting us to follow. We turned back, deciding not to play its game. After a night of broken sleep, we convened on the porch the following morning to review the camera footage. My stomach churned as I drank strong coffee. Dread coiled tight in my gut. Lauren powered on the small monitor, scanning through hours of nighttime video. At first, we saw the three of us leaving the cabin, flashlights in hand, heading toward the swamp. The recording continued, capturing only the gentle sway of the cypress trees in the faint moonlight. Then, at around 1:13 a.m., the picture froze for an instant. A shape flickered across the frame, so fast we almost missed it. Lauren scrubbed back the footage. We played it in slow motion, hearts in our throats. There, Passing through the porch light was a silhouette. Tall, lanky, with limbs slightly too long to be human. It had no distinct facial features visible, but the shape of its head and torso were upright, bipedal. A blur, yes, but unmistakable. Dennis swore under his breath. "It walked right up to the house," he muttered. "We were out in the swamp, and it was here." The figure seemed to sniff around the door, or at least tilt its head in a curious gesture, before gliding out of frame. We saw it vanish into the darkness. My mouth went dry. This wasn't just a weird footprint or an odd sound. Something had come onto our porch at night. Something not quite human. We spent the day formulating a plan. The next time the chanting or the lights appeared, we'd face it head on. We prepared torches, flashlights, weapons, and more wards. My nerves felt electric, dread mingling with a strange determination. This was our home now. We refused to be chased away by whatever was haunting the swamp. Night fell, starless and thick, as if a blanket of clouds had decided to smother any comforting light. The cicadas were deafening. We waited inside, all lights off except for a single lantern in the center of the room. Midnight approached, then 1 a.m. Nothing. Finally, around 2 a.m. the chanting started again, fainter this time, as though someone was testing our resolve. Dennis grabbed his pistol, Lauren her knife, and I lit the torches, determination pounding in my chest. We stepped outside onto the porch. Every shadow seemed alive. The chanting grew louder, coming from behind the cabin this time. We circled around, hearts hammering, the torch flames dancing wildly in the breeze. The swamp felt suffocating, as if the air itself was thick with malevolence. There, in the moonlight, we saw it, leaning partially behind a cypress trunk about 30 yards away. A form nearly as tall as me, with elongated arms and a vaguely humanoid outline. I raised my torch, flooding the area with warm light. The figure jerked, revealing briefly what looked like a face, pale, eyes reflecting the torch's glow. Lauren let out a sharp gasp. "What do you want?" she yelled. The creature, or spirit, or whatever it was, let out a low hiss, a sound that vibrated through the still air. Then it darted off with impossible speed, its movement so fluid it seemed to float rather than run. Dennis fired a shot into the darkness, more out of fear than strategy. The bullet's echo reverberated among the trees. We chased after it, adrenaline trumping caution. But within seconds, the figure vanished, and the chanting ceased. We stood there among the mossy trunks, torch flames illuminating our shaken faces. The night was silent again, except for the hammering of our hearts. Dawn found us exhausted, sitting around the small table in our cabin. No one spoke for a while. Lauren broke the silence first. "I don't want to leave," she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. "This is our home." Dennis leaned back in his chair. "What are we up against, though? A ghost? A demon? Some swamp spirit? Even if we don't have a name for it, it's not messing around." I nodded slowly. "We've come too far to give up, but we can't pretend we're safe. We need better defenses. Maybe talk to that historian again, or a local shaman, somebody who knows the deeper lore." Though fear gnawed at me, I felt an odd surge of devotion to this land. The swamp's dark waters had always felt alive, but I never guessed they'd harbor such ancient mysteries. The thought of fleeing, of letting this malevolent presence chase us away, rankled my pride and broke my heart all at once. By afternoon, we began reinforcing our cabin, installing sturdier locks, adding more protective symbols carved into the porch rails, placing lines of salt around every window. Even though we couldn't be sure these measures would keep anything truly supernatural out, they gave us a semblance of control. Dennis decided to stay a while longer, at least until we knew more. He reached out to some of his contacts who had studied folklore across the country. Lauren researched local myths online whenever we made the trip into Folkestone for supplies. And me, I devoted myself to learning every nuance of the swamp, listening to its rhythms, mapping out the paths around our property, understanding which animals lurked where. The lights still came sometimes, flickering beyond the tree line. The chanting still echoed in the distance on certain nights, but we adapted, determined not to surrender to the fear. Over time, we discovered that the more we respected the land, cleaning up trash along the water's edge, offering small tributes like dried sage or cornmeal at the base of cypress trees, the fewer disturbances we encountered. That's not to say the presence disappeared entirely. Even now, months later, I'll sometimes wake in the pre-dawn hours with the sensation that I'm being watched through the windows. But it's less violent, less intrusive. Maybe we've reached some fragile truce with the swamp and its spirits. When people ask me if I'd recommend living off-grid near the Okefenokee, I never give a straight answer. How could I? The swamp is a realm unto itself, home to beauty and terror alike. For Lauren, Dennis, and me, it's a place we've chosen to endure, to coexist with the unknown. The footprints, the chanting, the figure with eyes that glow in the torchlight. These are reminders that not all mysteries of the wild can be tamed or fully understood. But we're still here, still hoping that one day the swamp's secrets won't haunt our every step. For now, though, we settle for uneasy coexistence. We stand on our porch at dusk, watch the fiery sun sink into dark waters, and brace ourselves for whatever the next night brings. I should have known the North Georgia mountains could be both majestic and unforgiving, but I never expected the forest near Dahlonega to harbor something beyond the veil of the ordinary. My husband, Thomas, and I came here to escape, me from the nightmares that followed my career as an investigative journalist, and him from the violent memories of his military service. We found solace in a tiny cabin deep in the Chattahoochee National Forest, passed down from Thomas's late grandfather. It felt like the perfect sanctuary, a place to unravel our tangled minds and find ourselves again. For a time, the wilderness offered quiet respite. Misty mornings brought birdsong, and the crisp mountain air reinvigorated us in a way the city never could. We built a routine of splitting logs for firewood, checking on our modest solar panels, and fishing in the nearby creek. Life slowed down, and our anxieties felt more manageable. Yet, the forest's silence grew ominous at dusk, as though the trees stood watchful, harboring secrets in their ancient boughs. My dreams, always vivid, became more disturbing. I'd see figures darting between evergreens, silhouettes in the moonlight that vanished the moment I tried to focus. At first, I assumed it was just my overactive imagination, an echo of the nightmares that had plagued me since I left journalism. But Thomas saw them too. Our cabin was far from any paved road, perched halfway up a slope blanketed in thick pines and oaks. Thomas had installed motion sensor lights around the perimeter, though we kept them off most nights to preserve energy. We relied on a small wood-burning stove for heat, and had no running water aside from what we collected from a nearby stream. One evening, I'd just finished washing a few dishes by lantern light when Thomas appeared in the doorway, his face grim. "Evie," he said in a low voice, "I saw something." He led me outside. The moon hovered just above the tree line, flooding the clearing with silver luminescence. Thomas pointed toward a stand of pines at the edge of our property. "I was chopping wood," he said, "and I caught movement between those trees. At first, I thought it was a deer, but it stood on two legs. A spike of adrenaline hit me, a leftover instinct from years spent chasing dangerous leads. Could it have been a person? I asked, my tone tight with worry. He shook his head. Too tall, It moved too fast. I've never seen anyone run like that. My throat went dry. Stories of cryptids, mountain spirits, and Wendigo-like beings flooded my mind. I'd once dismissed them as folklore, entertaining, but not real. Now I wasn't so sure. Over the next few days, we tried to rationalize what Thomas had seen. Maybe a black bear standing upright or a large shadow. But our doubts grew with each passing night. Dusk brought a chorus of whispers, faint, rustling murmurs that seemed to flit through the trees, though we could never pinpoint the source. It started small. One morning, we woke to find fresh scratches on the cabin door. 3 parallel gouges sliced into the wood, as if from large claws. We had no pets, and black bears rarely ventured so close to human habitations, especially not a single bear leaving only 3 neat scratches. Another night, I ventured outside with a flashlight to retrieve some water from the barrel we kept near the back of the cabin. I heard something rustle in the underbrush, a low scraping like claws on bark. The moment I shone the beam of light in that direction, the sound stopped. I felt an undeniable sense of being watched, my skin crawling as if an invisible presence hovered right behind me. Thomas, always the more level-headed of the two of us, insisted we gather hard evidence. So he rigged up motion sensor cameras around the cabin, cheap trail cams designed for hunters, but serviceable enough for our purposes. Every morning, we'd check the memory cards. Most of the time, they captured nothing but squirrels or raccoons. Yet, on the nights when we heard the whispers, we'd find entire blocks of missing footage, as if the cameras had glitched or been tampered with. I remember hearing about a local historian who might know something about these mountains. Thomas said one afternoon, rummaging through his grandfather's old papers. Grandpa had notes on local legends, ghost stories, all that stuff. She's mentioned here, Dr. Miriam Judd. We found a phone number scrawled in pencil. The next time we went into Dahlonega for supplies, we tried calling her. A measured, elderly voice answered, confirming she was still around. After some initial skepticism on her part, she agreed to meet us at a small diner on the edge of town. Dr. Judd was a slender woman in her 70s, with steel-gray hair pulled into a tight bun. Her eyes gleamed with curiosity and caution. She seemed to size us up immediately, as though she'd encountered people like us before, people with outlandish tales of the supernatural. Once we'd slid into a booth, we explained the strange events, the silhouettes in the forest, the scratches on our door, the whispers at night. She listened intently, occasionally making notes in a small, leather-bound journal. "You're not the first to report such happenings," she said in a hushed tone. "The mountains around Dahlonega have long been rumored to hide more than just wildlife. The Cherokee spoke of spirits, some benevolent, some less so, who would appear to lone travelers or families living deep in the woods." My heart thudded in my chest. Thomas, stoic as ever, leaned forward. "Do you think that's what we're dealing with? An old spirit?" Dr. Judd sighed, tapping her pen on the table. "Could be. Some call it a Wendigo-like presence, though that's more of a northern term, or an Uktena, which in Cherokee lore is a great serpent with supernatural powers. But there are countless variations. Often, these stories revolve around a being that feeds on fear. It's drawn to isolation. Isolation. That was exactly what we wanted, and maybe exactly what it wanted too. "Is there a way to stop it?" I asked, my voice low. She pursed her lips. "I've heard tales of families who armed themselves with knowledge, protective charms, local rituals, sometimes even just sheer will to stand their ground. Others left, never to return." With that, she handed us a photocopy of an old text referencing protective symbols once carved into mountain trees. "Try these," she said. "But be careful. If you provoke it, be prepared to defend yourselves." The drive back to the cabin felt heavier than usual. Clouds gathered over the ridges, casting the forest in a somber gray light. I gripped Thomas's arm. "If this gets worse, maybe we should leave," I murmured. "We only came here to heal, and I'm not sure either of us can handle more trauma." His jaw tightened. "I can't keep running, Evie. I spent years doing that, moving from city to city, job to job. This cabin was my grandfather's legacy. I feel like it's the last piece of family I've got." I understood. Much as I might hate the idea of confronting an unknown horror, I recognized the resolve in his eyes. He was done fleeing. That night, we carved the symbols Dr. Judd had recommended, a series of zigzags and circles, into several nearby trees. We burned dried sage around the cabin and sprinkled salt along the windowsills. These felt like small, desperate acts, but it was all we had. One moonless night, the forest went unnervingly silent. No crickets, no distant hoot of an owl, only a deafening stillness that made my ears ring. Thomas and I were inside, lanterns off, when we heard footsteps circling the cabin, crunching leaves with slow deliberation. I pressed my ear to the wooden wall. It sounded like 2, maybe 3 sets of footsteps moving in tandem. My heart pounded in my ears. Thomas grabbed his hunting rifle, slipping the safety off with an inaudible click. Then something pounded on the cabin's side with terrifying force. The whole place shook. I swallowed a scream. The footsteps continued, shuffling to the front door. I braced myself, thinking the door would burst open, but instead of smashing through, whatever it was began scraping along the wood, creating a horrible squeal. "Evie," Thomas hissed, motioning for me to get behind him. I crouched beside the stove, fear slithering in my gut. As the scraping persisted, I realized I could hear faint voices, or perhaps a single voice shifting pitch. It murmured something unintelligible, and then my own name, Evelyn, as if exhaled through the cracks in the walls. My blood turned cold. Thomas, trembling but focused, banged on the inside of the door with the butt of his rifle. "Get away!" he shouted. Silence. The scraping stopped, replaced by soft, mocking laughter that resonated through the night. Then heavy footsteps retreated into the darkness. We stayed up until dawn, half expecting the cabin to come under siege again. But aside from the frayed nerves and a few fresh claw marks, nothing else happened that night. By the time daylight filtered in, we were ragged with exhaustion. We decided we needed to consult Dr. Judd again, or anyone else who might have direct knowledge. But Dahlonega was a solid hour's drive. We'd have to leave the cabin unattended. Thomas suggested we check on the perimeter one more time before we left. Outside, we found the carved symbols we'd made were defaced. Deep gouges slashed through the bark, as though something wanted to break whatever protective barrier we had attempted. "That has to be a message," Thomas said grimly. "It knows what we're doing, and it doesn't like it." We drove back into town, our minds spiraling with fear and questions. We spent hours at the county library, combing through historical records, reading local folk tales. My background in journalism kicked in. I took notes on every rumored forest demon, whistling spirit, or Wendigo-like creature I could find. The narratives often shared one element. These entities thrived on fear and isolation, picking off those who were alone or already psychologically vulnerable. We discovered a mention of older Cherokee blessing ceremonies meant to protect homes. Though we weren't Cherokee, we hoped something in those traditions might help, but the details were sparse, and the ceremonies required knowledge we didn't possess. Sacred songs, special herbs not readily available in a grocery store. That afternoon, we caught Dr. Judd just as she was leaving her house. She lived in a modest home adorned with wind chimes and shelves of dusty tomes. She let us in reluctantly, scanning our anxious faces. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she remarked. Thomas described the midnight attack, the scraping, the laughter, the mocking voice. Dr. Judd pressed her lips together, her expression troubled. "It's become aggressive," she said. "If it's targeting you directly, speaking your name even, that's a bad sign. It means it's recognized you as prey." My stomach twisted at the word prey. "Then tell us how to fight it," I demanded, my voice trembling. "We're not leaving the cabin. Not yet." Dr. Judd hesitated, then disappeared into a back room. A minute later, she returned with a small pouch of herbs and a slender wooden talisman. "Hang this inside your home. It's a rough approximation of a protective charm. It might not fully banish the spirit, but it can help. Also, fill the pouch with white sage, cedar, and a pinch of salt. Burn it at midnight around the perimeter of your property. Speak aloud your intention that this place is yours, that no harmful presence may remain." We thanked her profusely and left, hearts pounding. It felt surreal. We were rational, modern people, yet here we were, placing our hopes in ritual charms and midnight burnings. But at this point, we had no better leads. Back at the cabin, we hung the wooden talisman above our front door. I fashioned a loop from twine to hold it there securely. Then Thomas and I gathered wood for a small fire pit we'd built just behind the cabin. We wanted to be prepared for the midnight ritual. We set up cameras again, ensuring the memory cards were fresh. If we were going to perform some mystical ceremony, I at least wanted to document any strange happenings. Thomas double-checked his rifle, laid out extra flashlights, and made sure our perimeter lights were ready. By late evening, clouds rolled in, threatening rain. "We might have to do this in a storm," Thomas muttered, glancing at the darkening sky. We pressed on anyway, determined. At midnight, we lit the fire. The flames sputtered, sparks dancing against the black sky. We tossed in the pouch of sage, cedar, and salt, inhaling the pungent smoke. Hand in hand, we walked around the cabin's exterior, murmuring words of intent. "This is our home. No harm may enter. Leave us in peace." At first, the forest remained silent but for the crackle of flames. Then, from somewhere beyond the tree line, came a guttural howl, a sound so low it rumbled in my chest. Another voice joined in, higher-pitched, wailing in echo. The volume built, as though a chorus of inhuman throats cried out against our ritual. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might faint. Thomas clutched my hand. "Keep going," he hissed. "Don't stop." We completed the circle around the property, chanting in unsteady voices. The howls and shrieks magnified, assaulting our ears. Then, as suddenly as they began, the sounds ceased. Nothing but the crackle of the fire remained, and the hiss of distant wind. We stood by the dying embers, breathing hard, adrenaline coursing through our veins. The night air felt lighter, as though a suffocating weight had been lifted. "Did it work?" I whispered. Thomas stared into the darkness. "Let's see if the cameras caught anything." We checked each trail cam's footage. In one clip, the audio recorder picked up faint howls, but the camera itself showed nothing visible in the shadows. Another camera glitched repeatedly during the ceremony, the screen static. Even so, we felt a flicker of hope. The presence that had tormented us seemed to have retreated, for now. For the next week, we slept more soundly. My nightmares lessened, and the cabin door remained unscathed. We credited Dr. Judd's charm and our midnight ritual. Perhaps, we thought, we'd proven ourselves not so easy to terrorize. But one night, close to dawn, I awoke to Thomas shaking my shoulder. "Evie," he whispered. "Hear that?" I strained to listen. The wind had picked up, rattling the cabin windows. Over that noise, I heard what sounded like scraping on the roof, slow, deliberate, as if claws were raking the shingles. My pulse hammered. Thomas grabbed his rifle and motioned for me to stay put. He slipped outside, boots crunching in the gravel just beyond our door. Every second felt like an eternity. Then came a frantic shout. I burst through the door with a flashlight, ignoring the goosebumps that rippled across my arms. Thomas stood near the back of the cabin, aiming his rifle upward. In the flashlight's beam, I caught a glimpse of something scuttling across the pitched roof, long-limbed, hunched, its eyes reflecting a dull yellow. My breath caught in my throat. Thomas fired a warning shot. The creature let out a shriek that trembled the air and leapt off the roof into the darkness. We scrambled to follow, but it vanished into the tree line. Panting, Thomas lowered the rifle, jaw clenched. Even though we never got a clear view, the fleeting shape and those eyes were enough for me to abandon any rational explanation. This was no simple predator. It had will, malice, cunning. At dawn, we found thick, fur-like clumps on the roof, though the texture was odd, somewhere between coarse hair and brittle pine needles. My stomach turned just touching it. We burned it in the stove, not wanting to keep any trace of that thing near us. Thomas and I faced each other in the morning light, the lines of exhaustion etched into both our faces. "We did everything right," he muttered, voice raw. "The charms, the ritual, it's still here." A wave of grief and disappointment washed over me. We'd come to these mountains for healing, but it felt like we were unraveling under constant siege. "I'm so tired," I whispered, wiping tears from my eyes. "I can't fight like this forever, Thomas." He sank onto a chair, placing his rifle on the table. "Neither can I." We sat in silence until the sunlight grew warm through the windows. Then, with a heavy sigh, Thomas got up. "Dr. Judd mentioned knowledge and armed defense could push it back, but if it keeps coming, we might have to accept that we can't chase it away for good." I looked at him, recognizing the pain in his eyes. He loved this place. It was all he had left of his grandfather. But it wasn't safe. If we stayed, we risked our mental health, possibly our lives. "We stand our ground," Thomas said. "Or we leave. Nothing in between." Guilt pressed on my chest. I wanted to leave, to escape the terror, but I also respected Thomas's tie to this land. We debated for hours, weighing our fear against our stubborn desire to stay. In the end, Thomas's own nightmares, flashbacks of war, became the deciding factor. He admitted that each supernatural assault felt like a new front in an endless battle. He didn't want to fight another war, especially not one he barely understood. That afternoon, we packed up essentials and loaded them into our old SUV. My heart twisted as I took one last look at the cabin, the ancient pines, the silent mountains beyond. Part of me wanted to fight, to prove my resilience, but the rational side knew we'd done all we could. We left just before sunset, driving down the rutted dirt road with the feeling that something watched us from the shadows. I couldn't help glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting a pair of glowing eyes to appear in the dust cloud behind us. We never saw the creature again, and perhaps that was for the best. We found a small rental on the outskirts of Dahlonega, closer to town, where the night was not so silent, not so oppressive. It pained Thomas to abandon his grandfather's place, but we promised ourselves that once we'd healed more, if we ever mustered the courage, we might return with better resources, more knowledge. For now, the Chattahoochee Forest can keep its secrets. Those ancient mountains hold a darkness we couldn't tame, and maybe they never will be tamed. Still, I like to think that in some hidden fold of that wilderness, our cabin stands as a testament to our struggle, a reminder that not all mysteries can be solved or vanquished. Some can only be fled, for the sake of sanity and survival. I first heard rumors about a witch inhabiting the marshes of Sapelo Island years ago, when I was an undergrad researching Gullah Geechee culture. Tales circulated of curses, clay dolls, and eerie midnight rituals. They had always seemed like colorful folklore, terrifying for children, but nothing more. Yet something drew me here as an adult, compelled me to leave my safe apartment in Atlanta for an off-grid cottage on the island's remote edge. I convinced my best friend, Olivia Kent, to join me. She shared my fascination with hidden histories, though her curiosity was tempered by a healthy dose of caution. We both wanted to write a book on the spiritual traditions of this coastal region, to shine a light on the mixture of African, Native American, and European influences that shaped local beliefs. Little did we know we'd stumble onto something that defied every rational explanation. Arrival on Sapelo Island. Sapelo Island sits off the coast of Georgia, reachable only by ferry or private boat. When we arrived, the air smelled of salt and decaying seaweed, a brackish tang that seeped into my clothes. The small cottage we'd rented stood in a clearing near the marshes, its wooden exterior battered by years of storms. But it had basic solar power, a rainwater catchment system, and a propane stove. No nearby neighbors, save for one or two fishermen who lived farther inland. Olivia took one look at the endless marsh grass and the gnarled live oaks draped in Spanish moss and let out a low whistle. "This place is hauntingly beautiful," she said, adjusting her glasses. "But I can see how legends take hold here. It feels ancient." That first evening, we strolled along the beach, letting the Atlantic breeze ruffle our hair. We heard rumors in town that the island's isolation fostered more than just quiet living. It nurtured old magic. As we walked back to the cottage under a moonless sky, a sense of anticipation buzzed in my veins. I believed we were on the cusp of discovering something extraordinary. Our research began smoothly enough. Interviews with friendly locals, visits to the small Sapelo library, and forays into the marsh to observe wildlife. Then, after a few peaceful days, the strangeness began. I woke up early one morning to find a small clay doll on our front porch. It was roughly fashioned, a lump of grayish clay molded into a humanoid figure, eyes marked with tiny shells. Alarm prickled in my chest. Who would leave such a thing here? Olivia came up behind me, still in pajamas. "What on earth?" She knelt to examine it, poking it gently with a finger. "It's so crude. Looks handmade. But by who?" We tried to rationalize it as a local prank or a child's art project gone astray. I tossed the doll in a bin outside, not wanting it in the cottage. That afternoon, I asked a few island residents if they knew anything about clay dolls. Most shrugged, though some looked uneasy. One older man, Old Man Rutledge, a fisherman with leathery skin and a perpetual squint, narrowed his eyes when I mentioned it. "Best to leave that alone," he said tersely, then refused to elaborate. The next day, 2 more dolls appeared, one on each windowsill. Olivia and I exchanged anxious looks. It felt like a warning or a message, though from whom we couldn't be certain. As the days passed, a series of minor but disturbing events began unfolding. The first time I heard footsteps on the roof, it was just after midnight. A light pitter-patter, as if someone crawled around above our heads. I rushed outside with a flashlight, scanning the rooftop. No one. Yet I clearly heard something. Olivia suggested raccoons or stray cats, but we never spotted paw prints. Instead, there were strange scuff marks that looked like small human footprints, though the spacing was wrong. Too close to be an adult's stride, too large to be a child's. Then came the whistling. Late at night, around the same time, a gentle, haunting tune drifted through the marshy air, weaving in and out of the wind. At first, I thought it might be a fisherman signaling his boat, but the tune was too deliberate, too eerie. It made the hair on my neck prickle. We tried to ignore these occurrences, focusing on our research. I interviewed local artisans about sweetgrass baskets and asked them if they recognized the clay dolls. The few that did shot me wary glances. "Those are no toys," one woman said quietly. "They're used in old curses, sometimes to frighten people away." Frighten them away from what? I pressed. She just shook her head. The witch's territory. If she doesn't want you around, you'll know. That night, after hearing more footsteps on the roof, I found a new doll stuck to our front door with some thick, tacky substance. The doll's head was twisted at an odd angle, and its arms were crossed over its chest. A chill shot down my spine. Desperate for answers, Olivia and I tracked down Old Man Rutledge again. He was hauling in nets from his small boat, eyeing us warily as we approached. I know you warned us, I began, but we need to understand. Who's making these dolls? Is it the witch? He grunted, hoisting his nets. Folk been telling that story for generations. A witch who once lived deep in the marsh, never aging, never dying. She cursed the island so her spirit could keep power. Some say she still walks, especially during the new moon, searching for intruders. Olivia cleared her throat. Is she a literal person, or more of a spirit? Rutledge shrugged. Depends who you ask. Might be both. Some have seen a woman in black wandering the marshes at night, calling the wind to do her bidding. Others say she possesses living people when it suits her. He finally looked up at us, something like pity in his gaze. You two should leave if she's taken a disliking to you. There's no reasoning with old magic. When the next new moon arrived, the wind whipped into a fury, rattling our little cottage. Rain battered the windows, and lightning turned the sky into a strobe of white and black. Olivia and I huddled inside, lights off to preserve our limited battery. The storm howled, and above it all we heard that same whistling melody drifting through the cracks in the walls. It felt like the storm was circling us, as though guided by an unseen hand. Our phone signals were non-existent. We had no easy way to call for help. Around midnight, a brilliant flash of lightning illuminated a tall figure standing in our yard, clad in what looked like tattered robes. I gasped, stumbling back from the window. Olivia, did you see? She peered out. Another flash. The figure was gone. I grabbed a flashlight and, adrenaline surging, threw open the front door. Rain pelted my face. I shone the beam across the yard, squinting at the sheets of water. Nothing but wind and darkness. Then I felt it. A presence behind me. A whisper of breath. I whirled around, heart pounding, to find only Olivia in the open doorway, calling my name. We dashed back inside, slamming the door. The next morning dawned bright and humid, as if the storm had never happened. Our yard was strewn with fallen branches and soggy clay dolls. Enough was enough. We decided to investigate the rumor of the witch's lair in the marshes. Though we had no concrete location, we hoped to find something tangible, proof of a hoax or a rational explanation. We ventured out after noon, following narrow trails through knee-high marsh grass, the ground squelching under our boots. The sun beat down, turning the air oppressive. Mosquitoes buzzed in frenzied clouds. Every now and then we found evidence of small altars, circles of shells, clusters of bones tied together with twine, or logs carved with strange symbols. At one point, Olivia froze, pointing to an area where the grass grew unusually short, revealing a patch of damp earth. There, half buried, lay more clay figurines, some smashed, others carefully arranged in lines. A sick feeling rose in my stomach. This was a place of ritual, no doubt. We pressed on until the terrain changed. The marsh grass gave way to a cluster of twisted oak trees. Their branches reached over us like skeletal arms. In the center, there stood a small hut made of driftwood and tin scraps. My heart thundered in my chest. We approached warily. The place smelled of brine and decay. The door was ajar, and inside we glimpsed shelves filled with jars of black liquid, dried herbs, and more clay dolls. The walls were covered in symbols I couldn't decipher, and a strange wind seemed to swirl in that confined space. rustling the leaves outside. I was about to step inside when Olivia grabbed my arm. "Don't," she whispered. "We don't know what's in there." A sudden noise, like a low growl, came from behind the hut. We both jumped. My flashlight beam wavered across the tree trunks, revealing a flash of movement. Could it be the witch or an animal? Panicked, we stumbled back onto the trail we came from, tripping over roots and tangling in the marsh grass. We didn't stop until we reached the sandy path leading to our cottage. That evening, a dense fog rolled in. We decided to stay locked inside, hearts pounding at every creak of the wind. Olivia and I took turns napping and keeping watch, determined not to be caught off guard. Close to midnight, I heard a muffled thump against the front door. I slipped out of bed, grabbing a lantern and a kitchen knife. Olivia followed, clutching a makeshift club. Outside, a faint silhouette pressed against the door, rattling it gently. I felt a surge of both terror and anger. "We know who you are," I shouted through the wood. "We saw your hut." A soft, raspy laugh sounded from the other side. Then silence. Cautiously, we opened the door a crack. The fog swallowed everything beyond the threshold, thick as smoke. I nudged the door wider, knife in hand, only to find no person or figure. Just a new clay doll pinned to the wood with a rusted nail. My stomach turned. The doll had long strands of what looked like dried seaweed for hair. Its mouth was formed into an O, as if it were screaming. "We should burn it," Olivia said. "All of them." I nodded. We gathered every clay doll we'd accumulated. Those on the porch, those tossed in the bin, even the soggy ones in the yard. We lit a fire pit, feeding the dolls to the flames one by one. They hissed and crackled, releasing an acrid smell. As the fire blazed, I felt a flicker of defiance. Suddenly, a gust of wind nearly extinguished the fire. A tall, hooded figure emerged from the fog at the edge of our yard. My blood turned to ice. Olivia let out a small cry. The figure lifted a gnarled hand. Even from a distance, I felt a wave of cold air wash over me, as though it emanated from that outstretched limb. The wind howled, swirling ashes from the fire into the air. A voice, feminine yet distorted, rang out. "You dare burn what's mine." My skin crawled. I gripped Olivia's hand, both of us trembling. "Please, we don't want trouble," I managed to say, my voice weak. The figure let out a shriek of laughter, the sound echoing off the oaks. "This island is mine. Your presence taints it." She advanced a step, and I glimpsed her face beneath the hood, eyes like dark pits, skin etched with lines that seemed older than time. I thought I saw shell beads dangling around her neck, but the details blurred as my vision swam with panic. In a surge of desperation, Olivia threw salt from her pocket into the fire, an old trick she'd read about for warding off spirits. The flames roared, flaring high. The witch let out a furious snarl, staggering back a pace as if she'd been struck. Flight or resolve. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. Heart-hammering, I dragged Olivia back into the cottage, slamming the door. We barricaded it with the flimsy couch. For hours, we listened to the howling wind and that hideous laughter circling our little home. It felt like a siege, but one waged by intangible forces. Near dawn, everything went still. No wind, no laughter, just an oppressive silence. My mind was made up. As much as I wanted to write a groundbreaking book about Gullah Geechee folklore, I had no intention of paying for it with our lives, or our sanity. "Let's leave," I whispered, barely able to form the words. "First, ferry out." Olivia nodded, face pale. "We should have listened to Rutledge. This is bigger than us." At sunrise, we hastily packed what little we had. I locked the cottage door out of habit, though I suspected no lock could keep out that kind of presence. We hurried to the docks, the thick humidity clinging to our clothes. The ferry ride back to the mainland felt surreal, like waking from a prolonged nightmare. I stared at the receding shoreline, half expecting to see a tall, hooded figure standing at the water's edge. But the fog concealed everything. In the weeks that followed, Olivia and I tried to piece together the experience. We wrote down every detail, every eerie sight and sound, uncertain whether to share the story publicly. Would anyone believe us? Or would they dismiss it as hysteria or exaggeration? Ultimately, we agreed to keep the specifics vague in our research. We'd mention the witch legend as a footnote, a cautionary tale about meddling in local traditions without respect for the underlying beliefs. But we never revealed the full truth. Some things we felt were best left undiscovered. Neither of us returned to Sapelo Island. Even now, the memory of those clay dolls and that hooded silhouette haunts my dreams. The only solace I take is knowing we escaped with our minds, mostly intact. But a piece of me still wonders what lurks in those marshes, sustaining a power that feels older than civilization. If you ever visit Sapelo, and you find a misshapen clay doll on your doorstep, heed the warning. I wasn't always a man adrift. 20 years ago, I wore a badge for the Savannah Police Department, certain my life had a clear purpose: protect and serve. But a single night of chaos shattered that illusion. A routine call spiraled into a shootout, bullets flying through the humid Georgia air. I took a hit, my partner took two, and an innocent bystander lost his life. Though an investigation cleared me of wrongdoing, I never truly shook the guilt. I spiraled, let the nightmares consume me, and lost everything that mattered. My job, my sense of worth, and damn near my sanity. I drifted for a while, taking odd security jobs, sleeping on couches, trying to drown the memories in cheap whiskey. My sister, Camilla, was the only person who never gave up on me. She'd visit whatever dive I was holed up in, buy me a meal, and tell me, "Jonas, you've got to find something to live for." I'd just nod, shame burning my cheeks. Her words stuck somewhere in my mind, though, because when I learned I'd inherited a small tract of land in Scriven County from a distant relative, I called her immediately. Maybe this was the sign I needed. A place away from the noise and judgment. A place where no one knew me as the ex-cop who couldn't save his partner. The land bordered the Savannah River, a swath of thick woods and muddy banks that stayed quiet most of the year. There was an old hunting cabin on the property, more of a shack than a house, but Camilla and I spent 2 months renovating it. We tore out rotted boards, replaced the roof, and rigged a basic off-grid system of solar panels and a generator for backup. We installed a water filtration setup to pull from the Savannah River. It was tough labor, but honest, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like my life had direction. Camilla moved in with me. She'd recently ended a toxic relationship and welcomed a chance for a new start. She was younger than me by almost 10 years, but she had a sturdy spirit that always kept her going. She handled practical matters, budgeting, inventory, making sure we didn't starve, while I tackled the physical tasks, like felling dead trees for firewood or reinforcing the shed behind the cabin. Out here, the hum of insects and the rustle of pines replaced the city clamor. At night, we'd watch the moonlight shimmer on the wide Savannah River, feeling almost peaceful. It was a relief at first, that calm. With no neighbors for miles, I thought I could finally step out of the shadow of my past. But I should have remembered that silence can hide things far more sinister than city streets ever did. It started with the voices. Late at night, when Camilla was asleep and I stared at the walls fighting my old insomnia, I'd hear my name whispered from outside. Jonas. A soft, drawn-out sound, like a breeze forcing its way through jagged teeth. I told myself it was just the wind or my own guilt playing tricks. I poured another shot of whiskey, closed my eyes, and waited for dawn. The next morning, I stepped onto the porch, bleary-eyed, to find 3 sets of footprints pressed into the soft mud around the cabin. They were spaced out as though someone had circled the house in the dark. 2 sets were ordinary shoe prints, but the 3rd set looked odd. The toes seemed elongated, claw-like. At least, that's how my mind interpreted them. I wondered if I'd misread some animal tracks, but I couldn't convince myself. My background in law enforcement had taught me to observe detail, and these prints didn't match any animal I knew. I showed Camilla, who frowned but stayed calm. Could be some trespassers messing around, she suggested. Maybe they had a dog. Let's not freak out. We decided to lay out a perimeter of crude alarms, cans tied to fishing line, strung between the trees, hoping to catch whoever might be skulking about. I tried to shake off the unease and focus on the day's tasks, but from that point on, I felt watched. When I gathered water from the river or chopped wood out back, I got the prickly sensation that eyes tracked my every move. I'd spin around to see only swaying branches and the endless pines. At night, sleep became a battleground again, with me half expecting someone or something to barge in. It didn't help that Camilla had begun experiencing nightmares of her own, vivid dreams where dark shapes crowded around her bed, whispering. Our alarms remained quiet until one overcast evening when I heard the clatter of tin cans. I grabbed a flashlight and my old service pistol, motioning for Camilla to stay inside. The flashlight's beam cut through the murky darkness as I crept toward the tree line. The night was still except for the crickets, which seemed eerily louder than usual. My boots crunched leaves beneath me, and I tried not to breathe too hard. The tin cans continued to rattle, as if something had snagged the fishing line and was now shaking it violently. I reached the perimeter and found the line snapped in 2. The cans lay scattered, empty, with no sign of who or what might have tripped them. An animal might have run off, sure, but the tension in my gut told me this was intentional. I scanned the woods with my flashlight, heart pounding. For an instant, I thought I glimpsed a figure standing between the trunks, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing something that draped over its frame. I froze, my pistol aimed, but the flashlight revealed only a crooked pine where I'd thought the shape stood. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the shadows, though the feeling of being watched didn't ease. Camilla and I decided we'd reinforce the cabin itself. I installed new locks on the doors and shutters for the windows, while she hammered sheets of plywood to fortify the back entrance. We told ourselves we were just being cautious, that we still wanted to stay here long term. We had come to find peace, after all, not to get run off by some unknown intruder. I told Camilla about the nights when I heard my name whispered on the wind, and she confessed she too had heard voices calling for Jonas, as if mocking her inability to help me. I tried to keep calm, chalking it all up to stress, but I knew, deep in my bones, there was something more going on. One afternoon, while Camilla was tending our garden, I took the truck into the nearest town for supplies. Screven County isn't exactly bustling, but there's a small general store and a church at the crossroads. I parked in front of the store, loaded up on dried goods, and saw a notice on the bulletin board. Pastor Abram White was offering Bible study sessions. I'd never been particularly devout, but I remembered the comfort faith gave some folks. Maybe it could give me answers. I felt a pull to go see him, though I couldn't explain why. I found Pastor White outside the church, sweeping the steps. He was tall, wiry, with a salt and pepper beard and dark eyes that seemed to hold a sadness beyond his years. He greeted me warmly, though I sensed a flicker of recognition, like he already knew who I was. When I mentioned I'd inherited old farmland near the river, his friendly expression flickered to concern. He leaned the broom against the wall and invited me inside. We sat in a simple office with stained glass windows, casting colored light. I told him about the strange footprints, the voices at night, the feeling of being watched. I half expected him to dismiss my story or blame it on my fragile mental state. Instead, he nodded, clasping his hands together. "I've heard tales about that stretch of land along the river," he said. "Stories handed down for generations. Folks claim there's a presence there, something they call a devil or demon. It feeds on guilt, fear, sorrow, whatever darkness people carry in their hearts. Sometimes it shows itself in nightmares or whispers. Sometimes it's more direct." My stomach tightened. "And you believe that?" He stared at me with unwavering intensity. "I believe there are things we don't understand, Jonas. Sometimes what we call the devil is just evil given a shape. Other times, it's worse than anything we can name." I asked him what I could do. He suggested prayer and faith, but also a practical approach. Keep the property well lit, carry a symbol of protection if I had one, and refuse to give in to despair. "Evil preys on weakness," he said. "Don't give it a foothold." I drove back to the cabin with mixed emotions. On one hand, I felt validated that someone believed me. On the other hand, the gravity of it sank in. If something truly malevolent lingered in these woods, my fight had only begun. That evening, Camilla noticed my unease. I told her about my talk with Pastor White, half expecting her to scoff, but she surprised me. "I've been seeing something, Jonas," she confessed, eyes downcast. "At night, through the window by my bed, I've seen a shape, like a tall man or creature standing among the pines, just staring at the cabin. When I blink, it's gone, but I know it's real. I can feel it watching me." A chill ran through me. I embraced her, wishing I could protect her from the things I couldn't even fend off myself. Camilla was the strongest person I knew, yet here we were, huddling in fear like children, terrified of the dark. We decided to set up a more deliberate watch system. One of us would stay awake until midnight, then wake the other to keep watch until dawn. We installed a motion trigger camera out back, with extra floodlights we'd rigged to a spare solar battery. If anything approached, we'd see it, or at least capture proof. Our first night of watch duty was tense but uneventful. The second night, around 2 a.m., I heard the cameras chime inside the cabin, indicating movement. I leapt from my chair, beckoning Camilla. We rushed to the monitor, which displayed a shaky night vision feed of the backyard. My chest seized as I saw a silhouette gliding along the edge of our property. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed slightly too long. Even in the grainy footage, I could sense something off about its proportions. I took my pistol and a flashlight, and Camilla followed with a shotgun. We crept outside, floodlights blazing, the yard lit up in a harsh white glare. Nothing stood in the beams. I scanned left and right, expecting to see that shape lunge at us from the darkness. But all we found were footprints in the mud that led to the tree line and then vanished. The camera footage played back the same short sequence, the silhouette moving, then a burst of static, then nothing. It was as if the device malfunctioned just when we might have gotten a clearer image. A pit of dread formed in my stomach. If something supernatural was toying with us, it was doing a damn good job. Camilla wanted to consult the church. She told me she couldn't keep living under siege without trying every option. So we both drove to see Pastor White again. He welcomed us with a grave nod. After hearing our update, he said he'd come to the cabin for a blessing ritual if we wanted. We agreed, hoping maybe an act of faith would drive out whatever haunted our land. He arrived the next afternoon, dressed in casual clothes, carrying a simple wooden cross and a worn Bible. Camilla and I led him around, showing him the property lines. He paused under a large oak by the river, closing his eyes as though feeling the energy in the air. He recited prayers, sprinkled blessed water, and asked us to repeat after him that this land was ours, that evil had no place here. It felt both solemn and strange, like stepping back into an older time when people turned to prayer against the unknown. That night, we sat with the pastor in the living room of our cabin, sharing coffee and trying not to jump at every sound. He seemed calm but alert, as though waiting for a confrontation. Around midnight, the wind picked up, howling across the river. We heard branches tapping the roof in an erratic rhythm. Then came the voice. "Jonas," it whispered from outside, slow and deliberate. Pastor White set his coffee mug down, his eyes darting toward the window. The voice spoke again, calling my name with a mocking drawl. I clenched my fists, forcing myself not to bolt outside. The pastor motioned for me to stay put, but I couldn't stand it. I had to see. Camilla and Pastor White followed me as I opened the front door, gun in hand. The motion floodlights snapped on, illuminating swirling dust and the distant silhouettes of pines. Something flickered at the edge of the light, a shape that resembled a man but wrong in subtle ways. I heard a low growl, felt a suffocating wave of dread that nearly buckled my knees. Pastor White lifted his cross, his voice firm. "By the authority of the Almighty, leave this place." His words rang out, surprising me with their conviction. The shape hissed, receding a few yards, as though the cross had burned it. A single flash of lightning, though there was no storm, illuminated it fully for just an instant. I saw hollow eyes, skin like stretched shadow, and then it vanished into the dark. We stood there, hearts pounding, while the wind died down. Pastor White exhaled shakily, lowering the cross. He muttered that he'd felt something profoundly evil in that moment, unlike anything he'd experienced. Camilla was trembling so hard, I wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Pastor White left in the early hours, insisting he'd return if we needed him again. Camilla and I slept little, but at least for the remainder of the night, the property stayed quiet. I wanted to believe the blessing and the pastor's presence had driven the thing away for good, but in my gut, I knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The next morning, we found fresh claw marks on a tree near the cabin, deep gouges set in threes, like some beast had raked it in fury. The bark around the wounds was blackened, as though scorched. Camilla stared at them, her eyes filled with tears. I wanted to comfort her, promise we were safe, but I was too shaken, uncertain we could ever break free from the thing that haunted this land. We spent the day reinforcing everything again, nailing planks across vulnerable windows, checking the camera feeds, and clearing brush around the cabin so we'd have better lines of sight. My old training kicked in. If we were under siege, we'd make it as hard as possible for the enemy to approach unseen. Yet a part of me wondered if anything we did would matter against something that seemed to slip through shadows and distort electronics at will. Camilla tried to talk me into leaving. She said the nightmares were worse, that she'd woken in the night with the sensation of a hand around her ankle, dragging her toward the doorway. She was convinced we'd only be free if we left Screven County altogether. I understood her fear, but I also felt a grim resolve. This was the only place I'd managed to carve out as mine. I didn't want to run, not again. I'd failed too many times before. If I abandoned this last chance for peace, what would I have left? I told her I wanted to stay. I promised I'd figure out a way to defeat whatever was out there. She didn't argue, but I saw the doubt in her eyes. That night, in a final attempt to reclaim our home, we decided to hold a vigil outside by the river. We built a large bonfire on the sandy bank, the flames dancing in the starless sky. The reflection on the water was almost hypnotic, the embers sparking a primal sense of both fear and hope in me. We stood together near the fire, Camilla clutching a silver cross, me holding the pistol at my side. We spoke aloud that we claimed this land, that we wouldn't yield to evil. The wind swirled, stirring the flames until they towered above us. For a moment, I was sure we'd see that shape manifest in the darkness beyond the flickering light. Yet no figure appeared. The forest remained silent, as though holding its breath. When the fire began to die down, we let the last embers glow in the warm night air, waiting for a sign of the presence. Nothing came. We returned to the cabin, tired, drained, but feeling a small spark of hope. Maybe it was gone. Maybe our stand had worked. We slept deeply for the first time in weeks, lulled by the hush of the river. The morning dawned bright, and for once I woke without dread clawing my chest. I checked the yard, the perimeter, even the cameras. No footprints, no new scratches. Had we finally driven it away? Camilla and I felt lighter, talking over coffee in the early sunlight. We agreed we'd give it a few more weeks. If nothing else happened, we'd stay for good, farm the land, find a quiet life. She seemed more at ease, though her eyes still flicked to the windows now and then. A few days passed peacefully. We fished, we tended our small vegetable patch, and we even considered adopting a dog for added security. Late on the fourth day, as we prepared dinner, the wind shifted suddenly. An odor like rotten eggs and stagnant water seeped into the cabin. Camilla gagged, covering her nose. My stomach lurched at the putrid stench. Then came a whisper, quiet yet distinct. Jonas. It floated through the open window, laced with mocking glee. My heart sank. I ran outside, scanning the tree line, pistol in hand, but saw nothing in the thickening dusk. The smell intensified. Every hair on my neck bristled. Camilla joined me, shotgun at the ready. We heard movement among the bushes, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. The motion floodlights blinked on, revealing fleeting glimpses of a distorted silhouette weaving between the trees. It let out a low growl that resonated in my skull, and then it vanished once more. We dashed in pursuit, staying within the light's reach. But we made it only a few steps into the brush before it was gone. In that moment, I realized we might never truly be free from this thing. We could pray, we could fight, we could burn fires, but it thrived on fear and anguish, and I was a man loaded with guilt, a man who'd watched his partner die. That darkness still lived in me, and perhaps it was an endless supply of sustenance for the presence lurking outside. Camilla turned to me, tears streaking her face. "Jonas, we can't do this forever," she said, her voice trembling. "Staying here might kill us or break our minds." I pulled her into a hug, wrestling with my pride and my desperation. She was right. How many times had I woken screaming from nightmares, only to find a real nightmare waiting beyond the cabin walls? How many times could I stand guard against a force that slipped through the night like a living shadow? I was exhausted from fighting ghosts, both in my head and in the dark woods around us. I glanced at the moon's reflection on the river, thinking about how that same water flowed downstream toward Savannah and out to the ocean. It felt like a sign that maybe I needed to let go, to follow the current of life rather than cling to a piece of land that only amplified my demons. With a heavy heart, I told Camilla we'd pack up. We'd find a safer place, maybe rent a small apartment in town, figure out a new start. She released a shaky breath of relief, and I realized I needed relief as much as she did. We spent the next day gathering our belongings and loading them into the truck. I paused on the porch to look back at the cabin, a simple structure that had briefly represented hope. The windows we'd shuttered, the locks we'd installed, the bullet holes in the yard from warning shots all spoke to a war we hadn't won. But there was no shame in admitting we were outmatched. Sometimes you can't beat the devil in his own domain. As we pulled away, I spotted a figure at the edge of the tree line, the same tall, broad-shouldered shape, just watching us leave. My gut twisted, but I didn't stop. If it had come to gloat, so be it. I pressed the gas, and we rumbled down the dirt road, never looking back. On the way to a motel near town, Camilla reached over and squeezed my hand. "We'll find another way, Jonas," she murmured. And I nodded, numb but strangely lighter. I still carried my guilt, But maybe I could learn to bear it somewhere that wasn't infected by a lurking evil. I wasn't sure what the future held. All I knew was that the land in Scriven County would remain, silent and watchful, a place that had once promised salvation but delivered something closer to damnation. At least we got out alive. That was enough for now. I've always been prone to stress, but by the time I finished my second year of medical school, I felt like my heart was ready to burst. My family insisted I take a break, find a peaceful retreat, and reset myself before burnout swallowed me whole. That's how I ended up near Lake Lanier, living in a small off-grid house that my cousin Brandon inherited from our late uncle. We both thought it was the perfect solution: quiet, scenic, with no city lights or sirens, nothing to distract me from rest, and a little soul-searching. But I quickly learned that Lake Lanier had its own way of haunting a person's mind, especially at night. I arrived on a blistering August afternoon, the air sticky and still. My car rattled down a narrow dirt road that wound through thickets of pine and oak before opening onto a small clearing. The off-grid house stood there like a forgotten relic, its wooden frame battered by years of humid summers. Brandon had arrived the week before to fix up the place so we could at least sleep on mattresses instead of cots. He greeted me with his usual wide grin, sweat already soaking his shirt. "Welcome to paradise," he said, tossing me a bottle of water. "Hope you don't mind the ambiance. We've got bugs big enough to carry you off if you're not careful." He was joking, but I could sense a hint of unease beneath his cheerful exterior. The house itself was powered by a few solar panels Brandon had set up on the roof. Water came from a nearby well that my uncle had drilled ages ago. The biggest inconvenience for me was the lack of reliable cell service. This deep in the hills near the lake, coverage flickered on and off, leaving me isolated from the outside world. Part of me liked that idea, but another part felt uneasy right from the start, as though I were stepping onto land that wasn't welcoming me. That first evening, we decided to make a little celebration of it. Brandon grilled some burgers over a small charcoal pit while I set up battery-powered lanterns inside the house. We had just enough signal to stream a few songs on my phone, the music crackling in and out. The sun sank lower, painting the sky orange and pink, and for a moment I felt a wave of gratitude. Maybe I could finally unwind here. We sat on rickety chairs behind the house, where a slope led down toward the shoreline of Lake Lanier. The water gleamed, reflecting the final colors of dusk. Brandon cracked open a couple of beers, and we toasted to a simpler life. As the last of the sunlight drained away, we joked about the local urban legends. People claimed Lake Lanier was cursed, that entire drowned towns lay beneath the surface, and that ghosts wandered its depths. I laughed it off, blaming the stories on half-truths, but I saw a flicker of worry in Brandon's eyes. He admitted he'd heard strange sounds at night, like children laughing or crying. I brushed it off at first, telling him it was probably neighbors across the lake, but the nearest houses were a good distance away, and most of them weren't even occupied year-round. Eventually, the night wrapped around us, and we moved indoors. That was when the first unusual incident happened. Right as I turned off the lantern, I heard a noise, like tiny footsteps scuttling across the floor. My heart kicked up a notch, and I flicked the lantern back on. The noise stopped. Brandon frowned, but tried to reassure me it was probably a mouse or something. We shrugged it off and called it a night. I woke up around 2 a.m. from a vivid nightmare of drowning. My lungs burned in that dream, like I'd swallowed half the lake's water. I sat up in bed, gasping, sweat beading on my forehead. Brandon was still asleep in the makeshift bedroom on the other side of the hallway. I got up to get some water, my bare feet pressing against the creaky old boards of the living room. As I passed by the main window, I thought I saw motion by the shore. It was dark, but under the moonlight, I glimpsed a small figure, child-sized, standing at the edge of the water. I rubbed my eyes and the figure vanished. I wanted to believe my mind had conjured it, leftover dream fragments mixing with the moonlit landscape. Still, it took me a long time to calm down. The silence of the house felt oppressive, like a weight on my chest. When I finally did fall back to sleep, I dreamed of a child's laughter echoing through murky water. By morning, my head felt as heavy as a boulder. Brandon found me in the kitchen, sipping instant coffee. "Rough night?" he asked, and I told him about the figure by the lake. His expression hardened. "I swear I saw a kid out there last night too, or maybe more than one. Couldn't sleep, so I took a walk outside, and from a distance I saw shapes near the water. They disappeared before I got close." He lowered his voice. "I thought it was just me, or maybe I dozed off on my feet." Neither of us wanted to jump to paranormal conclusions. We decided to walk down to the shore and look for footprints. It was mid-morning, the water placid, a few birds gliding overhead. We trudged through the tall grass and found the shoreline still damp from the night air. And there, set in the mud, were small footprints like those of a child. They led from the water up the bank, then disappeared into the grass. My stomach flipped. Brandon crouched and touched one of the prints. The mud still soft. It had to be recent. We stood there, scanning the area. Across the water, we could see the distant outline of a boat dock and some houses, but no people. The footprints had no corresponding adult prints. It felt all wrong. We took photos with Brandon's phone. What else could we do? Part of me wanted to walk around and call out for a child in case someone was lost or hurt, but we found no sign of anything living. Eventually, we trudged back to the house in uneasy silence. Over the next few days, little oddities piled up. The door to the house would swing open on its own in the early hours of the morning, despite us locking it at night. We'd hear tapping on the windows, only to find nothing but empty yard. Brandon once woke to a strange wet footprint on the kitchen floor, as though a bare foot had stepped out of the lake and into our house. Each time something happened, the hairs on my arms would prickle, and I'd feel a deep sense of sorrow and confusion, as though the air itself were mourning. I tried to focus on my reading for school, or at least the medical articles I'd saved on my tablet, but the more I tried to concentrate, the more my mind wandered to the history of Lake Lanier. Even in my half-hearted research, I discovered it had been formed by flooding entire communities decades ago. Graves had been relocated, but rumors claimed not all were moved. Over the years, a startling number of drownings and accidents occurred in these waters. A lot of folks online believed the lake was haunted by restless spirits. I'm a woman of science, but I couldn't ignore the mounting evidence around me. My gut churned every time I looked out the window and saw that expanse of calm water. Brandon suggested we talk to someone local, maybe a historian who could shed light on the lake's past. So we ventured into Gainesville to visit the local library. We found a reference librarian who pointed us to a woman named Marla Green, a local historian and self-described paranormal researcher. Marla agreed to meet us at a small coffee shop near the square. She was a quiet woman in her late 40s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a gentle smile. When we explained our experiences, the footprints, the nighttime laughter, the strange door openings, she took notes without judgment. "I've heard similar stories before," she said, stirring her coffee. Children seen at the water's edge, wet footprints in cabins, cold spots inside otherwise warm houses. Often, people report hearing sobbing or giggling at odd hours. It's as though these spirits are reaching out, trying to connect with the living. I felt a chill race down my spine. "Do you think they're the spirits of drowned children?" I asked quietly. She nodded. "That's one theory. Lake Lanier was created by flooding entire towns, displacing families. There have been many accidents and drownings over the years. Some folks believe these children never moved on, that they're trapped here. Brandon leaned forward, tapping his finger anxiously on the table. Is there a way to help them? Put them to rest? Marla sighed, pushing her glasses up her nose. It's not that simple. Some of these spirits might not even be from one time period. If they're truly stuck, they may be wandering, repeating patterns tied to the trauma of drowning. I've heard of cleansing rituals, but in my experience, it's more about understanding their story. We thanked her, though we left feeling the burden of an unsolvable mystery. The idea that the souls of children roamed our land was both heartbreaking and terrifying. I wondered if empathy alone could mend something that felt so deeply rooted in tragedy. That evening, we tried to address the spirits directly. We waited until dusk, lit candles by the shore, and spoke to the lake as though we were speaking to children. I told them we meant no harm, that we wanted them to find peace, that if they needed help, we were willing to listen. Brandon held a flashlight, scanning the tree line just in case. The water lapped at the bank, peaceful and unresponsive. After a while, we retreated to the house, the wind whispering through the tall grass as we climbed the slope. I felt foolish, yet the act itself brought a strange sense of calm. That night, I woke up to a light tug at my blankets. My eyes snapped open, heart racing. The moonlight spilling through the window revealed nothing but the shape of my small bedroom. I tried to move, but terror paralyzed me for a moment. Then the tug came again, more insistent. Finally, I managed to sit up and click on a lantern. The room was empty, but at the foot of my bed, the blanket was mussed, as if a small hand had grabbed it. I heard a faint giggle, high-pitched and fleeting, then silence. Adrenaline surged through me so powerfully, I had to focus on breathing. When I looked at the floor, I saw droplets of water forming tiny footprints, leading back out into the hallway. I grabbed the lantern, stepping over the footprints, calling for Brandon. He burst out of his room, hair disheveled, clutching his phone as a makeshift light. I pointed down at the wet tracks. His eyes widened. We followed them through the hall, around a corner, until they vanished right in front of the living room doorway. I switched on the living room lantern and found nothing. The front door was still locked. No open windows. It made no logical sense. By morning, my nerves were frayed. Brandon hadn't slept either. We talked in circles. Should we leave or stay? I felt torn. Part of me wanted to run back to the city, bury myself in the comforts of modern life, but I also sensed a responsibility to these spirits, especially if they were truly children. Brandon admitted he felt the same pull. Something was crying out to us, and leaving felt like abandoning them. In the following days, the strange occurrences escalated. Doors slammed shut on their own, and once we heard the distinct sound of a ball bouncing on the living room floor. We were outside at the time, hurrying in to find nothing but scuffed dust, as if a small ball had indeed hit the floor. My sense of dread grew, overshadowed only by a deep sadness that seemed to permeate the house. Every new event carried a hint of playful innocence, twisted into something tragic and unsettling. We called Marla for guidance. She arrived one afternoon, her arms loaded with old maps and books. She said she wanted to research exactly where our house stood in relation to the original lake bed. We spread out the maps on the living room floor. Marla pointed to a spot indicating an old settlement. There used to be a small church and a schoolhouse here. Looks like the land extended down toward the creek that fed into the main body of the lake. It's possible your property overlaps part of that area. The idea that children might have once gone to school right where we lived made the footprints and giggles even more poignant. Marla suggested we perform a small memorial ceremony, acknowledging the spirits and attempting to grant them solace. She brought candles, lavender incense, and a silver bell. I didn't fully understand how these items worked, but she explained that certain rituals could help restless spirits find release. We gathered at dusk in the backyard, forming a circle. The sky blazed pink and orange, fading into purple as the sun sank behind the rolling hills. We lit the candles, and Marla rang the silver bell in slow, rhythmic intervals. I breathed deeply, feeling something shift in the air, as if the evening breeze carried whispers we couldn't quite hear. Brandon read a short prayer for the dead, his voice quavering but determined. Then Marla knelt by the grass and spoke directly to whatever lingered there, telling them it was safe to move on, that they were remembered. At first, nothing happened. Then the wind gusted, blowing out half the candles. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I heard a child's laughter again, drifting from the shoreline. Brandon's face went white, and Marla's eyes widened. Slowly, the laughter turned into a soft sob. My heart cracked at that sound. It wasn't meant for us. It was the echo of some long-ago pain. The sobbing faded into the hum of cicadas, leaving only the memory of sorrow behind. We let the remaining candles burn down to stubs, letting the silence settle around us. Marla said the ceremony might take time to have any effect. As the last glimmer of daylight died, we headed inside, exhausted. We offered Marla the spare couch for the night, but she declined, saying she preferred to keep some distance, that the heaviness in our house was overwhelming her senses. I understood. Even I felt claustrophobic. She left with a promise to check on us in a couple of days. That night, I slept like a stone, drained by the emotional intensity of the ceremony. Morning came, bright and clear, sunlight streaming in through the windows. Brandon and I each found ourselves reluctant to mention anything supernatural, as if acknowledging it would break the fragile calm. We tiptoed around the house, searching for any new footprints or signs of mischief. We found nothing. It was bizarrely normal. Birds chirping, the smell of coffee, a regular summer day. 2 days passed without incident. No footsteps, no laughter, no slamming doors. We ventured outside in the evenings, even had a little barbecue by the lake, half expecting shadows to appear. But the water remained tranquil. We began to hope that maybe Marla's memorial had worked, that we'd given the spirits the acknowledgement they needed to rest. On the third night of peace, I felt a nagging anxiety, as though I were waiting for the other shoe to drop, but the house stayed silent, and I finally allowed myself to relax. I slept well, dreaming only of drifting on a boat across a calm lake under the stars. It was a pleasant dream, almost comforting. In the morning, I stepped onto the porch, inhaling the crisp air. Brandon joined me, yawning. We exchanged cautious smiles. Maybe we'd made it through. Maybe I could actually recover here, finish my break from med school without losing my mind. I told him, "Thank you for convincing me to stay. It might have been easier to run, but I'm glad we tried to help." He nodded, and I knew we both felt relief mixed with lingering sadness. We haven't seen or heard the children's ghosts since. The house remains off-grid, simple and quiet. I still think about those wet footprints on my bedroom floor and that childlike giggle in the dead of night. When I walk along the shoreline, I sometimes get the feeling of being watched, but it's gentler now, more like a memory than a threat. If they're still out there, I like to think we offered them some measure of peace, or at least an acknowledgement that they existed, that their stories mattered. Brandon and I have decided to stay here a while longer. I won't lie. Some nights I catch myself straining to hear the faint echo of a child's voice, half expecting it to return. But the nights remain still, and the days pass uneventfully. I'm finishing my last weeks of rest before I return to med school, and though this place started out feeling cursed, it's ended up giving me a sense of calm I never thought possible. Maybe the spirits allowed us that peace once we recognized their pain. Lake Lanier still has its dark legends. Whenever I read about another drowning on the lake, I feel a pang of guilt, wondering if more restless souls will wander the shores. But as for the ones who found us, I believe they've moved on. I hope that, in some small way, our memorial ceremony, our empathy, or just the simple act of listening gave them what they needed. If they did indeed exist between one world and the next, we gave them a voice, however briefly. That might be all any of us can do for the unseen tragedies that linger in old places. I'll never forget those footprints by the water's edge, or the echoes of laughter and sobs. Even when I leave here, those memories will stay with me, reminding me that sometimes the past spills over into the present in ways we can't fully explain. If anyone asks me about Lake Lanier being haunted, I can only nod and say, yes, there are stories, but not all ghosts seek to harm us. Some just need us to remember them, and, for whatever reason, they found a way to make us listen. I suppose I always felt drawn to the North Georgia mountains. As a kid, I spent summers camping near Clayton, fishing in the chilly streams, and scaling rocky trails that wound through the lush green forests. Those memories remained bright in my mind, even when I grew older, and my life got tangled in environmental causes, protests, and endless meetings in city offices. Eventually, I decided I'd had enough of cramped apartments and constant noise. I wanted my own patch of mountain land, somewhere I could live off-grid and protect the environment I loved so much. It took years of saving, but at last, I found a small property in Roban County, a few acres with a rustic cabin perched just where the forest thickened and began its climb into the Blue Ridge Mountains. The place was old, rumored to be built decades ago by a man who disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The realtor shrugged it off as local legend, more story than truth, and I, blinded by the cabin's low price and my nostalgic longing for the mountains, brushed aside any concerns. All I saw was the potential for a self-sustaining haven. I moved in late spring, the air cool enough in the mornings to see my breath, the afternoons growing warm beneath a bright sun. My friend Joan Carpenter, a pragmatist who never put stock in ghost stories or curses, volunteered to help me get set up. She arrived in her pickup truck loaded with supplies, food, water, a generator for backup. When she first glimpsed the cabin, she whistled. Gray-brown logs, a creaking porch, slanted window frames. The place wasn't in great shape, but I felt a strange fondness the moment I set eyes on it. The forest closed in on 3 sides, a thick wall of pines and hardwoods, and, in the distance, I could see the ridges of the Blue Ridge stretching like ancient sentinels. Joan and I spent a few days tearing out rotted floorboards and patching the leaky roof. Every time we pried a board loose, the cabin seemed to sigh, as though disapproving of our meddling. The rancid odor we uncovered beneath the floors made me cough so hard I had to step out into the fresh air. Joan grimaced, claiming it was just mold from decades of damp. We cleared as much as we could, replacing timbers and trying to let fresh air circulate. By the time we were done, the cabin still looked rough, but it felt livable. I installed a small solar array in a clearing out front, enough to power a few lights and a laptop if I needed one. Off-grid life had begun. The first night, the forest sounds lulled me to sleep, the soft rustle of leaves, the distant hooting of an owl. Joan had gone back to her place across the county, promising she'd return in a day or two to check on me. I felt content, convinced this new life would be exactly what I needed. But when I woke at sunrise, a foul odor drifted through the cabin again, reminiscent of the moldy stench we'd dug out of the floor. It was even stronger this time, invading my nostrils and making my eyes water. As I scrambled up to find the source, I noticed deep scratches on the threshold of my front door. 3 ragged marks, uneven and fresh. I ran my finger over them, skin prickling. A bear, maybe? A wildcat? It felt too deliberate, like someone had raked a chisel across the wood. I tried to shake off the unease. I had known living out here would mean dealing with wildlife. That morning, I took a walk around the property, hoping to find some sign of a critter. The land was peaceful, sunlight dancing on dewdrops, birds flitting between branches, everything so green it felt like a dream. But then a breeze blew in, carrying that same rancid smell. It seemed to come from nowhere, as if the wind itself were tainted. My skin crawled. I hurried back to the cabin, telling myself I was just spooked from the scratches. But once inside, the odor disappeared as suddenly as it had arrived. I stood there in the living room, confusion knotting my stomach. Later that day, I walked along an overgrown footpath, searching for a freshwater spring someone had mentioned might exist on the property. Before I got far, I met my neighbor, Ezekiel Zeke Taylor. Or rather, he startled me half to death when he emerged from behind a tree. He was a wiry man in his 60s, sun-hardened skin and sharp eyes, the sort of person you suspect has spent more time in the woods than out of them. At first, he barely spoke more than a grunt. When I introduced myself, he seemed reluctant to say his name. Then, with a nod, he told me folks called him Zeke. I asked him if he knew anything about a spring, and he said yes, though he warned me the water might be foul by now. I felt disappointed. My dream had been to get all my water off the land. Then, in a slow, gravelly voice, he changed the subject. "You live in that old cabin, don't you?" I nodded, bracing myself for the usual ghost story or warning about structural problems. Zeke's gaze turned distant. "Some folk say that land's cursed," he muttered, "tainted by old sins. Be careful you don't stir up what's best left buried." I chuckled awkwardly, expecting him to elaborate. Instead, he tipped his hat, an old, battered thing, and walked off into the trees without another word. I tried to laugh it off, but the statement stuck in my mind all day. Maybe he just didn't like newcomers. Or maybe there really was some local legend about my property. I thought back to what the realtor said about the original owner disappearing. A chill ran through me. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sunlight had shifted into a golden glow, and I found that the front door, which I'd left latched, now stood slightly open. A rush of fear tightened my chest, thinking maybe someone was inside. I called out a greeting, heart hammering, but got no reply. The living room and kitchen looked undisturbed. Still, my nerves were rattled enough that I double-checked the windows and made sure everything was locked. That night, I found sleep elusive. The cabin creaked and groaned in the wind. Normal settling sounds, perhaps, but each one made me jolt upright. Around midnight, I heard a soft, scraping noise under the floorboards. I'd thought we'd removed the mold and anything else living down there. My mouth went dry as the scraping continued, like nails on wood. I forced myself to get out of bed, adrenaline racing, and grabbed a flashlight. The boards felt cold under my bare feet as I crept across the living room and shone the light at the seams in the floor. The scraping paused, replaced by silence so intense it pulsed in my ears. I carefully lifted the new trapdoor we'd installed for access to the crawl space, shining the beam downward. Nothing, just the dank smell of earth, bits of old insulation, a couple of cobwebs. The smell wasn't rancid this time. It was more the musty odor of soil. I waited a full minute, heart pounding. Finally, I lowered the door again, feeling foolish for spooking myself. Still, I barely slept the rest of the night. By morning, I was exhausted and edgy. Joan arrived in her truck around lunchtime, greeting me with her usual bright energy. My bleary eyes must have given me away, because she immediately asked if something was wrong. I spilled the details. The foul odor, the scratches, the open door. Zeke's cryptic warning, the scraping under the floor. Her expression softened from teasing to concern. She said, "Look, I know how your imagination can run wild. Let's check the place thoroughly." We combed every corner of the cabin, tapping on walls, shining flashlights into the crawl space, even checking the roof. Aside from some mouse droppings here and there, we found nothing suspicious. Joan argued it was either a stray animal or some old pipe shifting under the house. I clung to that explanation, hoping it was right. She stayed with me that night, and we shared a small dinner of canned soup and crackers. The real trouble started around 2 in the morning. I woke to Joan's voice calling my name in alarm. I stumbled out of bed, still half asleep, to find her standing in the living room, flashlight aimed at the wall. Words had been scratched into the wood. They were messy, uneven letters, spelling out a single phrase. "Get out." My heart lurched. Joan's face was pale in the glow of the flashlight. Neither of us had heard footsteps or movement in the cabin, yet the message was there, splinters and sawdust trailing down the wall. Without thinking, I tried to open the front door, wanting to see if anyone was outside. It wouldn't budge. The latch was undone, but the door felt stuck, as though something pressed against it from the outside. I yanked harder, fear and anger mixing. Then, with a sudden release, it flew open, and a blast of that rancid odor nearly made me retch. I stumbled back, gagging, as the smell seeped into the cabin. Joan covered her nose and mouth, eyes watering. We both staggered onto the porch, shining the light into the yard. Darkness stretched out. No movement, no sign of intruders, yet the stench lingered, enveloping the night air. We didn't sleep at all after that. Joan suggested we drive into town, maybe stay in a motel, but I stubbornly insisted on staying put. I told her I wasn't about to abandon the place I'd worked so hard to make my own. She gave me a dubious look, but conceded. The two of us waited for dawn, hearts pounding at every creak and groan, the words "Get out" scrawled on the living room wall like an open wound. In the morning, we decided we needed more information, so we paid a visit to Zeke's property. He lived in a small cabin of his own down a winding trail, hidden by tall pines. He answered the door slowly, as if he'd been expecting us. I asked him point blank what he knew about my land. He stepped onto the porch, closing his door behind him, clearly uncomfortable discussing it inside. "Years back," he said, "the fella who built that cabin got tangled with a woman folks called a witch. She was rumored to know curses, hexes, all sorts of dark stuff. They say he wronged her somehow. Story goes she put a curse on the cabin. Any who lived there would be driven mad or worse." Zeke paused, rubbing the stubble on his chin, then continued. "I don't put much stock in that, but I do know people claimed the place felt off. They heard sounds under the floor, like scratching or whispering. Some said they saw shapes in the woods, half-glimpsed figures. Others just up and left as soon as they could. You want my advice? Don't stay." When I asked for a more practical solution, he just shrugged. "Some folks tried rituals, had a preacher bless it. Doesn't stick. Or maybe the land itself is tainted." We walked away with no real comfort, just a deeper sense of dread. Joan muttered that it was probably an old rumor that fed on people's fears, but her voice lacked conviction. I felt anger rising, directed more at myself for being so naive. Still, I dug in my heels. This was my home, my dream, and I wasn't letting folklore scare me off. Joan couldn't stay forever, though. She had a life in Atlanta, a job, responsibilities. After we returned to my cabin, she stayed one more night, then packed her things to head out the next morning, saying she'd come back if I needed her. Her eyes told me she wished I'd just leave with her, but she knew how stubborn I could be. I spent the next day carving small protective symbols Zeke had mentioned, old mountain lore, around the windows and door frames. I scattered salt at the threshold. lit sage to cleanse the space. It felt almost silly, but I needed to do something, anything. For a few days, all was quiet. I allowed myself to relax slightly. I kept busy by clearing a patch of land for a garden and fixing the steps leading up to the porch. The rancid smell didn't return, and no new scratches appeared on the walls. A tiny voice in my head whispered that maybe I'd beaten it. Then I stumbled across the cellar. I hadn't known one existed. The cabin's original layout didn't show it. But as I moved boxes around in the back room, I found a hidden door in the floor, expertly concealed with boards. My pulse leapt. I pried it open, shining a flashlight into a narrow set of stone steps leading downward. A dense, stale air rose up, tinged with that same musty odor of soil and rot. My gut clenched. Maybe this was where the smell originated. The steps descended about 10 feet, leading to a small stone-walled room. Dust coated every surface, cobwebs draped corners, and in the middle, I found a crude wooden table. Resting on it was a small wooden box carved with strange symbols. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I opened the lid. Inside lay a collection of dried herbs, twisted bits of metal, and a single piece of parchment covered in what looked like archaic runes. My eyes struggled to make sense of it. Though I couldn't read it, I sensed it was something ritualistic. Suddenly, the flashlight began to flicker, the beam weakening. The stench of rot grew stronger, making me gag. I heard a low growl echo off the stone walls, though I saw no movement. Fear seized me. I slammed the box shut, shoved it under my arm, and scrambled up the steps back into the cabin. As soon as I reached daylight, the growling ceased. My flashlight steadied, and the air felt lighter. I slammed the hidden door shut, chest heaving like I'd run a marathon. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I found an old guide on Appalachian folklore on my laptop, combing through references to curses, hex bags, conjure items. The photos and descriptions reminded me of what I'd just seen in that box. My throat tightened as I realized that someone, maybe this alleged witch, had placed a powerful hex in the cellar. If the rumors were true, it might have been fueling the darkness in the cabin all along. I wished Joan were there. Or Zeke. Or anyone, really. But I was alone, heart pounding. If destroying the contents of the box could break the curse, I decided I had to try. So, flashlight in one hand, box in the other, I stepped out onto the porch at midnight. The moon was nearly full, bathing the yard in pale light. I built a small fire near the tree line, away from the cabin. As the flames rose, I stood there trembling, sweat trickling down my temples. My breath came quick and shallow, and each time I glanced toward the woods, I half expected to see a shape lurking. At last, I tossed the herbs and twisted metal into the fire, muttering that this curse was broken, that this was my home now. The metal hissed in the flames, sparks shooting upward. A blast of that foul odor hit me again, and I felt an unseen force pressing in on me, as though invisible hands tried to shove me away from the fire. I stood my ground, shaking, hurling the parchment in after the metal. It caught flame, curling black at the edges. The presence around me seethed, an almost physical sensation of anger and malevolence. I gasped, forcing myself to keep the parchment in the fire until it was reduced to ash. Then, as suddenly as it came, the oppressive force lifted, and the rancid odor drifted away. The fire continued to crackle, sending embers skyward. I collapsed onto the ground, relief and terror washing over me in waves. I had no idea if what I did was truly lifting a curse or just burning some strange relic, but the air no longer felt thick with dread. I stared at the moon, tears of adrenaline and fear slipping down my cheeks, wanting to believe it was done. I stayed up the rest of the night beside the dying embers, too wired to go back into the cabin. When dawn came, the world felt fresh and bright. Cautiously, I re-entered the cabin. There was no smell. The living room wall still bore the scratched words, "Get out," but even they seemed less ominous, as though the power behind them had vanished. I forced myself to check the cellar once more. Opening the hidden door, I found nothing unusual, just a barren space, dusty and cold, minus the wooden box I'd removed. No growling, no flickering flashlight. It was almost anticlimactic. In the weeks that followed, I waited for the other shoe to drop. New scratches, foul odors, ghostly whispers. But night after night, I slept peacefully for the first time since moving in. Whenever I heard creaks or groans, I'd still tense up, but the sense of malevolence was gone. Joan came back to visit, thoroughly impressed by the calm atmosphere. I told her everything, showing her the charred remains where I'd built the fire, though the details sounded almost surreal coming out of my mouth. She stared at the scratched words on the wall, eyebrows raised. Part of her wanted to stay skeptical. Maybe I'd just confronted my own fear. Yet she agreed the cabin felt different, warmer somehow. Over time, I scrubbed the scratched warning off the wall, patched the gouges, and repainted. The place became mine in earnest. I planted a small garden, replanted some saplings in the clearing to offset the ones I'd cut for firewood, and spent my days hiking or working on improvements. Zeke kept his distance, though one afternoon he ambled by. I mentioned the box. He nodded slowly, saying, "Heard talk of cursed talismans before. Guess you did what you had to." Then he offered no further comment, just a half smile that hinted he respected my tenacity. Occasionally, at dusk, I feel the prick of memory, a sense that something once dark and dangerous lurked here, and I wonder if it might resurface. But each time, the night passes without event. I remind myself how it felt to stand by the fire and reclaim the land I chose as home. This cabin and the forest around it still carry echoes of an old story, but maybe I closed that chapter for good. When people ask me if I recommend buying a cheap, remote cabin in the North Georgia mountains, I give a measured answer. It can be beautiful, but you need the stomach for its secrets. As for me, I've found purpose in caring for this land, in living with minimal impact. The darkest moments, scratching noises, ominous smells, cryptic warnings, have faded into memory, replaced by the steady rhythms of quiet mountain life. Sometimes, all it takes to break a curse is courage, conviction, and a willingness to confront the shadows, whether they're supernatural or born of our own fears. I'm not certain I could ever explain what truly happened here. Maybe the environment was tainted by old magic, or maybe I stumbled into a vortex of rumor and coincidence. Whatever the truth, I stayed, and the cabin is finally at peace, and so am I. I never really felt like I belonged in college. While my classmates immersed themselves in lectures and late-night study sessions, I drifted through the halls as if I were invisible, unmotivated and uncertain. Dropping out in my second year felt both terrifying and liberating, but I knew I had to do something, or go somewhere, that would give me purpose. When my grandmother passed and left me a patch of land outside Macon, I saw it as my chance to start fresh. My older sister, Ashley, decided to join me, insisting I wasn't cut out for total isolation. Truth be told, I was glad she came along. We were a few years apart, but I'd always felt she understood me better than anyone. The land was quiet and overgrown, with a small shack that had been abandoned for who knows how long. Grandma had once lived out there before, moving into an assisted living facility, and nobody had bothered with the property in years. Even so, I felt a pull, like this place was a chance to prove I could carve out a meaningful existence on my own terms. We had big plans: grow a garden, install solar panels, gather water from a refurbished well. It might not be glamorous, but at least it would be ours. The first couple of weeks were spent clearing debris and cleaning out the shack. The roof leaked, half the windows were cracked, and layers of dust coated every surface. But Ashley and I had a system. She handled practical tasks like patching holes and comparing prices for off-grid gear, while I managed the grunt work of hauling junk to a makeshift dump site in the woods. Bit by bit, the old shack transformed into a rough but livable space. When I finally collapsed onto a sleeping bag that first night under our patched-up roof, I felt a spark of pride. It didn't take long for that spark to dim. With no one else around, daylight hours fell into a slow rhythm, but nightfall carried a different energy, something that pressed in on me. At first, it was just an uneasy feeling, an impression that the woods were listening. I'd step outside to fetch water at dusk and hear faint rustling, but when I turned, I saw nothing. I figured it was animals, or maybe just my paranoia. Ashley, being older and more grounded, teased me whenever I showed the slightest sign of nerves. "City boy," she'd laugh, which was absurd, because I'd never really lived in the city. Still, she had a knack for making me see when I was overreacting. Then I started having nightmares. I'd jolt awake in the early hours, sweating and breathless, haunted by images I couldn't quite place. Robed figures moving through the pine trees, a bonfire's flickering glow, chanting so soft and eerie it left me trembling. I shrugged it off as stress. Dropping out of college and starting a totally new life was bound to trigger weird dreams. But one morning, Ashley poked her head into my makeshift room and asked if I'd been chanting in my sleep. I told her no, and the frown on her face deepened. She admitted she'd heard something in the middle of the night that sounded like my voice, chanting unintelligible words. That chilled me more than I wanted to admit. We continued to make improvements on the shack, installing a crude solar setup and fiddling with a generator we'd borrowed from a friend. One day, while I was digging near the well, I uncovered a strange bundle wrapped in old cloth. When I unwrapped it, I found bones, small animal bones, tied together with twine. My stomach lurched. It looked like some kind of ritual object. Ashley came over, eyes wide, and made me bury it again, deeper this time, as if that would erase it from our minds. We told ourselves it was probably just some old superstition, something a previous occupant had left behind. Even so, the discovery set my nerves on edge. A few evenings later, Ashley and I decided to visit the local library in Macon to research the land's history. We needed to pick up supplies anyway. That's where we met Caroline Rivers, the librarian who seemed a little too interested when I mentioned we were living on an old family property outside town. She was a petite woman with kind eyes, and when she heard the name Moran, she led us to a small archive room. She showed us records indicating that decades ago, a small cult had reportedly used that patch of woods for gatherings. Police had investigated missing animals and signs of occult activity, though no arrests were made. The information was scarce, but enough to make my skin crawl. Caroline hesitated, then explained that most folks around here were wary of outsiders who claimed property in those woods. Rumors swirled of dark rituals and sightings of hooded figures chanting at night. She said it might all be local legend, but she urged us to be careful. Ashley thanked her politely, but I sensed in my sister the same dread that churned in me. It felt like we'd discovered a crack in the veneer of our new life, and through that crack we glimpsed something we didn't want to see. That night, Ashley and I sat on the shack's porch, sipping cheap beer and discussing what we'd learned. Cicadas buzzed in the humid air, and the full moon lit the yard with pale light. We debated whether to leave or stay. She was adamant that we'd put too much effort into this place to scare ourselves off on the basis of rumors. I wanted to agree, but the memory of those animal bones lingered. After a while, we agreed to remain, on the condition that we take sensible precautions. We'd install motion sensor lights and keep a closer watch on the perimeter of our land. For a week or so, nothing happened. We gradually relaxed, chalking up our anxiety to local folklore. Then, one muggy evening, as I was heading to the well just past sunset, I heard the chanting again. It started as a low murmur, so subtle I wasn't sure it was real. But as I turned off the pump, I realized it was definitely chanting. Faint voices coming from deeper in the woods. My first thought was that some trespassers were messing around on our property. I turned to go get Ashley, and that's when I noticed a faint glow flickering between the trees. A fire, maybe 50 yards into the woods. My heart pounded as I rushed inside and grabbed Ashley. We armed ourselves with flashlights, pepper spray, and more bravado than sense. The chanting continued, growing slightly louder. We moved carefully through the brush, using our lights sparingly to avoid being spotted. As we drew closer to the glow, my stomach twisted in knots. I wanted to call out, but fear kept me silent. Suddenly, the chanting stopped. We froze, holding our breath. The glow vanished as if someone had snuffed the fire. In the next instant, footsteps thundered through the undergrowth. We swung our beams around, catching a glimpse of a figure in dark clothing sprinting away. Ashley shouted for them to stop, but the figure slipped into the shadows. The woods fell silent, leaving only the chorus of insects and our ragged breathing. When we approached where the glow had been, we found nothing but a scorched patch of earth. No sign of whoever or whatever had been there. Ashley and I retreated to the shack, adrenaline coursing through us. We locked the door and spent the night jumpy and wide awake, every creak of the floorboards setting us off. By dawn, we were both exhausted, but determined to figure out what was going on. Maybe it was just a couple of kids messing around, or maybe something more sinister was unfolding right in our backyard. We decided to install a few cheap trail cameras around the perimeter of the property to see if we could capture any suspicious activity. The cameras yielded nothing for days, even though Ashley and I occasionally heard distant chanting at night. It was so sporadic that I began to wonder if we were hearing echoes of our own imaginations. Then, one early morning, Ashley woke me with panic in her eyes. One of the cameras had captured movement at 3 a.m. We played the footage on her laptop. The image was grainy, set in night vision, but we could make out a group of 4 or 5 figures moving single file along our property's edge. All wore dark robes with hoods pulled low over their faces. Ashley and I watched, horrified, as the figures paused, and one of them turned toward the camera, as if aware they were being filmed. The face was nothing but a pale blur, impossible to discern. Then the feed cut to static. When the video resumed a few seconds later, the area was empty. I felt a lump in my throat. Part of me wanted to pack up and run. Another part refused to be chased away from land that belonged to my family for generations. We called Caroline, explaining what we'd seen. She sounded worried, urging us to contact the authorities. But what would we tell them? That robed figures might be trespassing at night? With no clear evidence of a crime, the police would likely do a cursory check and dismiss our story. We decided to handle it ourselves at first, but we agreed to loop Caroline in if things escalated. Things escalated. One evening, we returned from a supply run in town to find dead animals arranged in a circle near our front porch. Squirrels, possums, maybe a stray cat, all of them mutilated and placed in a ritual pattern. I staggered back, retching, while Ashley swore under her breath. It was a grotesque warning, and one we couldn't ignore. She grabbed her phone, hands shaking, and called the police, who arrived about an hour later. 2 officers surveyed the scene with dispassionate eyes, took notes, snapped a few photos. They said they'd keep an eye out for suspicious activity, but they had no leads. Could be some kids playing a prank, one officer said, lacking conviction. We both knew no kid would go that far. They left, and Ashley and I were stuck cleaning up the ghastly remains. I felt anger and disgust that anyone would do something so cruel. That night, I stayed awake, half delirious with fear and fury, gripping a baseball bat as if it would protect me from the intangible horror lurking in the trees. A few days later, Caroline came out to see us. She brought a heavy old book, its cover worn, pages brittle with age. It was a local history text that mentioned devil-worshipping sects that once operated in rural Georgia. There were references to chanting circles, blood sacrifices, and a man who supposedly summoned dark entities near Macon centuries ago. Superstition or not, the parallels were too strong to ignore. Caroline suggested we might be dealing with a modern-day cult trying to resurrect old rituals. Ashley and I decided we'd had enough. We weren't about to abandon our inheritance without a fight. So we devised a plan. We'd confront them directly if they returned, armed with cameras, lights, and whatever defenses we could muster. Caroline insisted on helping, claiming it was better to stand together than let us face it alone. We spent a tense afternoon rigging more lights around the property and checking our makeshift weapons, mostly pepper spray, a hunting rifle Ashley had borrowed from a friend, and a couple of blunt tools. That very night, as if sensing our readiness, the chanting began again. This time it was louder, echoing from deep within the woods. We grabbed our gear and advanced carefully. My heart hammered so fiercely I thought I'd pass out. Caroline carried a small recorder, determined to capture proof. The chanting swelled, unnervingly rhythmic, and flickering lights, possibly torches, glowed through the pines. We pressed on, determined to reach the source. I nearly dropped my flashlight when something screeched in the undergrowth, a feral cry that froze my blood. Still, we kept moving, drawn by both terror and resolve. At last, we emerged into a small clearing. Half a dozen robed figures stood around a makeshift altar carved from a tree stump. A single torch sputtered, casting dancing shadows. One figure held a knife. Another chanted words I couldn't make out, voice low and guttural. Caroline gasped, and in that instant, all 6 figures spun toward us. Ashley lifted the rifle, her voice shaking as she shouted for them to back off. The chanting ceased, replaced by hissing whispers. The robed group separated like a pack of wolves circling prey. One figure threw something into the torch, a powder that ignited in a flash of green flame. My nostrils filled with a rancid chemical smell. "Stay back!" I yelled, brandishing my flashlight and pepper spray. It felt woefully inadequate. Another figure lunged forward, and Ashley fired a warning shot into the ground, the crack of the rifle splitting the night. The robed intruder stopped short, hissing out a curse. I saw pale hands gripping that knife, muscles tense. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, as if responding to an unseen signal, the figures dashed away into the darkness, scattering in different directions. We tried to chase them, but fear and the thickness of the woods slowed us. Within moments, they vanished like ghosts. The clearing fell silent except for our panting breath and the flickering torchlight. Caroline stood near the stump, stunned, her recorder in hand. We stared at one another, the reality of what we'd just witnessed hitting us like a physical blow. We reported the incident to the police the next morning, this time with Caroline as a witness. The officers looked skeptical, but admitted something strange was happening out there. They promised more patrols, but we could see in their eyes they didn't expect to catch a robed cult in the act. Meanwhile, I found myself questioning everything. Why us? Why now? What was their motive? Part of me feared they were summoning something vile, using our land as a focal point. The rational side of me insisted they were just disturbed individuals playing at evil. Either way, it was an ongoing threat to our safety. After much deliberation, Ashley and I chose to stay. We'd worked too hard building our off-grid life to just walk away. We fortified the shack, adding stronger locks, more lights, and keeping our rifle loaded. Caroline visited often, researching ways to repel or expose the cult if it persisted. It felt like living under siege. But strangely, the knowledge that we weren't alone in this helped. There was a grim determination in Ashley's eyes that told me she wouldn't give these fanatics the satisfaction of scaring us off. And I, though often fearful, refused to back down as well. In the weeks that followed, we caught glimpses of robed figures at a distance, either scouting our property or performing smaller gatherings deeper in the woods. Each time we spotted them, we raised a ruckus, firing a warning shot, shining bright lights, calling out. Gradually, they seemed to shift away, as if we'd become too much trouble. Still, I spent many nights haunted by the memory of that chanting, uncertain what dark beliefs fueled their rituals. We haven't eradicated them entirely. In Macon's shadows, local legends and real human malice intertwine. But we've claimed our small corner of the woods and stood our ground. The shack remains ours, battered but defiant. Sometimes I still wake in the night, half expecting chanting outside my window. Other times, I think I hear voices calling my name from the tree line. But with Ashley's unflinching resolve and Caroline's unwavering support, I sleep easier than I once did. I can't say life has become idyllic. The specter of that hidden cult lingers at the back of my mind, and I wonder if they'll ever try a more brazen attack. But this land is my family's inheritance, and I feel a strange pride in claiming it as home, protecting it from those who'd corrupt it for their twisted ends. I don't know if the old stories of devil-worshipping or robed figures will ever fade. Macon has its secrets, and maybe it always will, but so do we, and we're not afraid to fight for what's ours. Sometimes, on calm mornings when sunlight filters through the pine needles, I almost forget the fear. The air is peaceful then, carrying bird song and the rustle of leaves. Maybe that's when I appreciate our decision the most, staying put despite the threats. Ashley and I have learned to trust each other's strength, and Caroline has become a friend we value more than words can say. It's not the life I envisioned when I dropped out of college, but it's a life that matters, grounded in defiance against whatever darkness lurks in these woods. If you ask me whether I regret leaving campus to chase an off-grid dream, I'm not sure I can give a straight answer. Some days, I miss the oblivious comfort of living where the scariest thing you face is a failed exam. But then, I remember the nights by the bonfire with my sister, the satisfaction of building something with my own hands, the fierce pride of protecting what's mine, and I know I made the right choice. Even if the chanting returns, even if those robed figures try again, I won't run. This is our land. We may have inherited its hidden shadows, but in time, maybe we can fill it with our own light. I never quite understood why the old house spoke to me the way it did. The moment I stepped onto the rickety front porch, with the smell of marshy wetlands drifting on the humid savanna breeze, I felt an odd combination of fear and inspiration. Maybe it was the sagging roofline or the tattered shutters, but something about that neglected little house at the outskirts of the city tugged at me. I convinced myself it was perfect for my art retreat, for rediscovering the creative spark I'd lost somewhere between endless gallery receptions and the noise of everyday life. I told myself I wanted solitude, a place to let my imagination run free. If I'd known what waited inside, I might have thought twice about signing the lease. My friend Marcus Tate tried to talk me out of it, of course. He was my occasional collaborator in art projects, a practical guy who balanced my impulsive nature. We stood together in the overgrown yard that first day, staring at the warped front door and the peeling paint on the clapboards. his arms crossed tight over his chest. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Jen, you can't be serious," he said, glancing at the marsh behind the property. "You're miles from civilization. There's mold on the walls, and you can practically feel the termites chewing through the beams." I laughed it off, telling him I'd paint the place up, patch a few holes, and transform it into the perfect artist's hideaway. He just shook his head and told me I was going to do whatever I wanted anyway. As I fished the keys from my pocket, I felt the dampness of the sticky Georgia heat settling over my skin. I promised Marcus I'd be safe, that this would be a quick project, no more than a few weeks of quiet painting. He grumbled something about calling the nearest fire department if the place collapsed on me, then helped me carry in my supplies. The first few days, I was too busy cleaning and unpacking to notice anything odd. The house was indeed in rough shape. Floorboards creaked ominously whenever I stepped on them. The plumbing rattled with every flush, and the windows let in every mosquito for miles around. But I chalked all that up to the normal challenges of an old property left to rot. At night, I'd take my battered notebook to the single bedroom that wasn't infested with spiders, sketch out ideas for new paintings, and drift off to sleep to the chirping of frogs in the marsh. It felt suitably rustic for an aspiring artist. Then the laughter began. I was hunched over a canvas one humid afternoon, trying to capture the tangled Spanish moss draping from the oak trees in the yard, when I heard giggles from somewhere in the house. Soft, playful, unmistakably childlike. At first, I thought Marcus was pranking me. He sometimes sneaked up to record sound effects or whispered nonsense while I worked, just to see if I'd notice. But he'd gone back to the city that morning, leaving me alone. I set down my brush, listening. The giggles stopped. I ventured through the musty hallway, searching for any sign of an intruder. Dust floated in the slivers of light coming through a cracked window. The floors groaned under my weight, but there was no one there. Just the half-furnished rooms I'd been slowly cleaning up. I peered into closets, checked the bathroom, even unlocked the creaky attic door. Nothing. Only cobwebs and old boxes. No sign of children, living or otherwise. I shook off a flutter of unease and went back to my easel, trying to focus on the lines and shapes I wanted to capture on canvas. That night, the laughter returned, echoing through the dark corridors. I shot upright in bed, my heart hammering. The clock on my phone read 2:13 a.m. A thin layer of sweat covered my skin, partly from the unrelenting heat, partly from the sudden chill I felt. I leaned forward, straining to listen. The giggles seemed to rise from the very walls, echoing faintly around me. I snapped on a flashlight, adrenaline pumping, but the laughter vanished the moment the beam hit the peeling wallpaper. I managed to fall back asleep only after convincing myself it must be some strange effect of the swamp's nighttime wildlife, maybe frogs or distant voices carrying on the humid air. But the next morning, I discovered a row of tiny, wet footprints tracking across the living room floor. The prints were the size a small child might leave, though how or why a child would wander in here barefoot at night was beyond me. My nerves jangled as I examined them. The footprints were arranged in a peculiar curve that ended near a rotted section of wall, then vanished as abruptly as they began. I felt the impulse to take a photo, but a creeping dread made me hesitate. Maybe I didn't want evidence of something I couldn't explain. I tried to carry on with my art that day. Each time I lifted a paintbrush, though, my thoughts darted to the footprints, the laughter. My mind churned, mixing worry with an unsettling fascination. That night, I couldn't resist exploring the attic once more, searching for any hidden passage or clue. Dim, overhead bulbs flickered as I rummaged through old crates. Most were stuffed with dusty newspapers, chipped porcelain figurines, and rusted tools. But then I found a small wooden chest tucked behind a loose beam. Inside were children's toys, A few battered dolls, a broken music box, and a scattering of marbles. My stomach twisted at the sight. The toys were arranged so neatly, as if someone had recently played with them. A part of me wanted to grab the chest and toss it all in the trash, burn it even, but a deeper curiosity kept me from doing so. Instead, I closed the chest and set it aside. Something about those old toys tugged at my heart. They weren't just discarded junk. They felt like relics of someone's story. I left the attic, unsettled but oddly inspired, my imagination running wild with images of ghostly children. Marcus arrived a couple of days later, bringing groceries and fresh brushes. He listened with growing disbelief as I recounted the laughter, the footprints, and the chest of toys. His eyes darted around as if expecting a child to appear from behind a door. "Jen, you're not messing with me, right? You always did like a spooky tale." I swore it was all true, leading him to the attic to show him the wooden chest. He opened it, gaze fixed on the worn dolls. He admitted it was creepy, but insisted there had to be a rational explanation. Maybe some local kids had wandered in to play, or maybe I was scaring myself with my own artwork. I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I sensed something else was at play. Later that afternoon, we drove into Savannah to pick up supplies. While Marcus loaded the cart with extra flashlights and a fan to combat the heat, I wandered off to an antique shop I'd noticed on my last trip. The sign read, "Baines Antiques," and rumor had it the owner had a knack for psychic insights. I never put much stock in that sort of thing, but something compelled me to go inside. The shop smelled of old books and lavender incense, the air cool against my sweaty skin. Behind the counter stood a woman who introduced herself as Rosalie Baines, a tall, willowy figure with dark curls and a quiet intensity in her gaze. I hadn't planned on sharing my experiences, but she must have seen something in my face. She asked me if I'd witnessed anything unusual out near the wetlands. My pulse sped up. Carefully, I relayed the gist of the laughter, the footprints, and the chest of children's toys. Rosalie listened without so much as a blink. When I finished, she nodded, expression grave. She mentioned that long ago, a devastating epidemic struck parts of Savannah, including families living near the marshes. Some children passed away in those isolated homes, never receiving a proper burial or farewell. She believed restless spirits of these children sometimes lingered, bound to the objects or places they once knew. I asked if she thought the toys in my attic belonged to such children. She shrugged. "Could be," she said softly. "If the children never found peace, they might be reaching out. Maybe they're curious about you, or maybe they just want recognition." My chest tightened, both sad and intrigued. I wanted to know more, but Rosalie suggested I tread gently, that if there were indeed spirits, they might resent forced intrusions. Marcus was waiting for me outside with the supply cart, rolling his eyes when I told him about my talk with Rosalie. He thought it was all superstition, though he conceded that a place as old as Savannah might harbor plenty of ghost stories. We hauled everything back to the house, me lost in thought about the epidemic, the possibility of child ghosts, and how my presence here might have stirred them. The odd occurrences continued. I'd step into a room and hear faint giggles in the corner, or open a door and discover those child-sized footprints in new, perplexing patterns. My sleep became fitful, filled with dreams of pale, sad-eyed children standing by my bed. The more I painted, the more those same children emerged on my canvases, their expressions mournful or pleading. I never recalled meaning to paint them. It was as if my brush moved of its own accord, capturing their silhouettes in watery blues and grays. Marcus grew concerned for my mental health, urging me to take breaks or even consider leaving for a few days. But I felt a compulsion to stay, as though I'd been chosen to communicate with these children through my art. It wasn't just about being stubborn. I genuinely believed I could help them find closure. That notion probably sounded absurd to anyone else, but it fueled my every waking moment. Rosalie visited me at the house one late afternoon. I showed her the footprints, the old toys, and the paintings that had begun to fill my small living room studio. Her expression flickered with sympathy and wariness. She explained that these spirits might be trapped by unresolved sorrow, that they might not realize they're no longer alive. When I asked her if there was some ritual or way to banish them, she shook her head. "They aren't evil," she said gently. "They're children who suffered a cruel fate. They need comfort, understanding, maybe a sense of love to let go." We decided to try a small ceremony at dusk. Rosalie brought lavender and chamomile for a cleansing smudge, while I arranged the worn dolls and toys in a circle on the living room floor. Marcus hovered nearby, uneasy, but he stayed in case things got out of hand. We lit candles and sat quietly around the toys, Rosalie murmuring a soft invocation, asking the spirits to find rest. I closed my eyes, visualizing gentle light enveloping the space, an image of warmth and acceptance meant for any lost souls. The air felt electric, like static before a thunderstorm. For a moment, I heard the distinct sound of children's voices in harmony, soft, fleeting, full of longing. My skin prickled, but the sense of threat was absent. Instead, it felt heartbreaking, as though they were finally being heard. Then the voices faded into silence, and the candle flames steadied. I opened my eyes to find Marcus pale, jaws clenched, while Rosalie looked peaceful yet exhausted. Over the next few days, I noticed fewer footprints in the house, fewer instances of giggling. My paintings shifted in tone. Instead of sad, grayish scenes, they began to show children bathed in gentle light, or smiling faintly beneath warm, pastel skies. It was as if the spirit's energy had changed, growing calmer. I started to believe we'd truly helped them move on, or at least soothed their restlessness. I was packing up my brushes one evening when the house's front door creaked open on its own. A wave of cool air swept through. My heart leapt, half expecting to see a small, ghostly figure. Instead, I sensed a presence, like a child standing shyly at the threshold. I said aloud, "It's okay. I'm here." In that moment, I felt a breeze caress my cheek, tender like a farewell. Then the door closed with a soft click, as if guided by tiny hands. I stood there in the dim glow of my studio lamps, tears burning my eyes. It felt like a goodbye. Marcus returned a couple of days later, worried he'd find me in a worse state. Instead, I greeted him with a calmness he didn't expect. He surveyed the house, noticing I'd hung my new paintings on the walls. The sense of foreboding had lifted, replaced by a gentle stillness. While some might call it a coincidence, I believed the children's spirits had found peace, or at least enough of it to stop their nightly wanderings. I decided to remain in the house longer than originally planned. My paintings were flowing more freely than they had in years, and I felt deeply connected to the land, the marsh, and its mysterious history. Marcus teased me for playing ghost nanny, but even he admitted the place felt different. He'd sit in the living room, tapping his foot nervously, but no laughter came from behind the walls. No footprints appeared overnight. I think he was relieved to see me less anxious, more grounded. When Rosalie visited again, she beamed at the transformation. I thanked her for her guidance, though she insisted I did all the work by listening with an open heart. I placed the old dolls back in the attic chest, wrapping them carefully. Something told me they weren't entirely lifeless, but they no longer carried that heavy sadness. If they belonged to those spirits, I hoped they might remain as a gentle memory rather than a tether to suffering. A few weeks later, I held a small gathering at the house, inviting a couple of fellow artists and local friends, including Rosalie and Marcus. We displayed my new paintings around the living room. Many of them featured children in soft hues, their outlines merging with beams of sunlight or blooming flowers, symbolizing release and growth. I didn't share the full story of what had happened here, just that the house had been an unexpected muse, unlocking something I couldn't have reached in the bustle of the city. My guests admired the artwork, commenting on the bittersweet yet hopeful atmosphere. In a way, it felt like a final tribute. To this day, I live in that small, neglected house on the outskirts of Savannah, near the marshy wetlands. The structure remains humble, creaky in the wind, prone to leaks when the summer storms roll in. Yet I've grown attached to its quirks. Sometimes, when I'm working late at night, I sense a gentle shift in the air, as if the children peek in to see how I'm doing. But the terror and sorrow that once enveloped the place have faded into distant echoes. People ask me if I ever feel scared, living so close to a realm few understand. I answer honestly. I was frightened at first, but the fear gave way to empathy. I believed those children needed a voice, and by painting them, maybe I offered some form of release. Whether you call them ghosts, spirits, or echoes of an unrecorded past, they touched my life in ways that defy simple logic. Even Marcus, the ultimate realist, seems to respect that something profound occurred here, something that turned a crumbling house into a sanctuary of healing. I don't pretend to have all the answers, nor do I try to replicate what happened. Art has always been my language, and in this quiet corner of Savannah, I finally found a story worth telling. I see it in every brushstroke, every detail of the children's faces, serene and free. Sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in mystery and sorrow, and it's only by embracing them that we discover solace. If anyone ever knocks on my door asking about ghost stories, I'll simply smile and say, "Stay a while. Listen, the walls might speak to you too."